federal contract. And it also ensures that these companies comply with state and federal labor laws, and they are at risk of losing a contract if they are found to be an egregious violator of these basic worker protections. The executive order takes an even further critical step to protect hard-working Americans by prohibiting the use of pre-dispute forced arbitration clauses in employee contracts for those companies with contracts greater than $1 million. Specifically, defense contractors cannot circumvent the civil justice system in employee disputes involving Title VII of the Civil Rights Act or sexual assault and sexual harassment cases. This amendment would violate the protections of that executive order and leave far too many workers vulnerable to abusive employment practices. And for that reason, I ask my colleagues to stand in opposition to this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further debate on this amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Klein. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from the ranking member requests a recorded vote, which will be postponed. Next, Mr. Johnson, do you have an amendment? If staff would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The NDAA process over the years through this committee has supported efforts to encourage the Department of Defense to find a way to offer combat training to its personnel while reducing unnecessary and cruel harm to animals. Despite our best efforts, however, the Department has been woefully slow to provide a concrete plan moving forward that will phase out the use of live tissue training. Considering the growing list of opponents both inside and outside of the military, the Department has no excuse for the delay, and I think they're slow rolling us. Not only does using live animals cost 4 times as much as using human simulators, 98% of civilian trauma programs agree that such training is neither effective or necessary. The use of live tissue training also puts our service members at risk. Rather than receiving the best medical training possible through human-based simulation methods, military medical personnel are forced to rely on techniques used in World War II. This is discouraging considering the vast majority of advanced trauma life support courses on the civilian side use simulators rather than animals. Finally, we must not lose sight of our ethical obligations to our fellow living beings and our own humanity in the name of training. With the advent of technology, there is no need for the Department of Defense to continue to poison monkeys to study the effects of chemical warfare agents, to force tubes down cats' and ferrets' throats as part of pediatric care training for military medical personnel, or to operate on live goats and pigs. Despite the ongoing urging of Congress on multiple occasions, DOD has yet to provide a definitive timeline or update for this committee on its use of simulators. While my standalone bill, the Best Practices Act, provides a plan for the Department to transition to the exclusive use of human-relevant methods, I believe we must give DOD an opportunity to update this committee on its work. My amendment directs the Department of Defense to provide us a report detailing a concrete plan moving forward, and I urge my colleagues to support this report language, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't disagree with this amendment anymore. As a surgeon who served in Iraq and is trained with live tissues, I can tell you that it is a process that enables our healthcare teams to save lives. And there is nothing that the simulator can do that replaces the live tissue. It's not even close. Our simulators have become very good, and they're good for day-to-day training. But when you're heading to combat, I guarantee you that you do not want somebody trying this on a human being for the first time that they haven't tried on a live animal, because nothing can replace bleeding and breathing and the things that you try to sustain. Are these animals that are being used? They're American heroes, if you want to know, because they are the ones that have helped train people to save American lives. So I don't know where you're getting your information. It's not unnecessary. As a surgeon, it was completely necessary, because I learned to do things that saved American lives. And to say it's not effective is false, because I can tell you it's very true that this process, this training process, helps you save American lives. So I would disagree with you wholeheartedly on this, and understand that this is coming from firsthand knowledge, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Special Operations has long used live tissue for a reason, because it saves lives. It would be nice to say that you can simulate combat. It would be nice to say that there are simulation devices that simulate the emotional stress, but that's not true. We're working harder on it, but we're not even close. And what's ethical is to make sure our troops in harm's way have what they need in case they get hit. That's what's ethical, and that's the job of this committee. And I invite the members as you walk in to look at what our job is: to raise an army and maintain a navy and fight this nation's war and to win. And giving our troops in harm's way everything they need, the right equipment, the right training, and the right rules of engagement is our job. And live tissue training meets those requirements. I yield back.
Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to concur. Yeah, I commanded a company, battalion, and ultimately a brigade in the 82nd. It's not the Special Operations Command, but it's, fine Americans, great paratroopers. And this live tissue training saved lives for us as well. And our medics, our combat lifesavers, all of this. And I do invite any member that has any question about this to go down and to talk to our troopers and to see the confidence and the competence they get from this training. And it absolutely saved lives. Yield back.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia? Oh, who's the, oh, Dr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everybody's comments, but what the amendment does is just ask for a study from DOD as to where they're at in phasing out live tissue training. If you voted for the FY13 NDAA, you already voted for the provision that encourages DOD to move away from live tissue training to simulation training. In fact, the Army has stated that their policy is that they're committed to the highest quality medical readiness training and must continue to include refinement, reduction, and appropriate replacement of live animal use, including adoption of validated alternatives such as emerging medical simulation technologies. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, Dr. Jonathan Woodson, said we must make progress towards the standardization, refinement, replacement, and reduction of our use of the live animal model. As somebody who was on faculty at the Uniformed Services University for 4 years, where at the time we did use live tissue training and have since moved away from live tissue training at the university, all we're asking for is for DOD to come back and say, where are you in the phase out? Look, there's a lot of misinformation regarding live tissue training. For the folks that have done it, it's that, quite honestly, it's the wow factor of working on some live tissue. But simulators are getting better. There are ways to be able to teach these procedures that do not necessarily need to use live animals. There's options to use cadaveric training. The simulators are getting better. All we're asking for is for DOD to come in and say, where are you in this process of moving away from live tissue training? For that, I would suggest supporting the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And since earlier I was deemed a doctor, I feel I have some legitimacy in this conversation also. Jokes aside, I do believe that what we're looking at is truly an opportunity for us to understand if if the Department of Defense has an alternative to live tissue training. I understand the medics, the corpsmen that were with me, they did great work over there in some really bad situations, and they had great training. But some of the things that we've seen, at least in some of the medical schools that I've been visiting with the live tissue that they're currently using, could really simulate the same thing, including bleeding and other types of instances and examples, and at the same time save money. It is cheaper for us to pay the one-time cost for a lot of these very expensive simulators than for us to consistently be buying some of these new live animals. So, and with that, again, this is just for us to look at, so we can see a report, so we can make further determination how far we've gone. And I believe that at least that we should follow through and vote for this amendment to see where it's gone since we last instituted the study. Thank you, and I vote aye.
I'd yield to myself briefly. I don't mind a study to see where we are with making progress. On the other hand, this amendment says we're disappointed with that more progress has not been made. We're concerned with the failure that has resulted in higher cost and suboptimal training, and that live tissue training lacks the necessary medical and financial justification to continue the program. I don't know any of those things are true. And I appreciate the comments that the gentlemen have made. I don't mind the subcommittee, and I think they should keep track of where we are and what is possible and what is desirable, but it seems to me that the language in this decides it, and I don't know that. And based on what I have been told from going to visit with some of these places myself, I'm not ready to make those judgments, and therefore I oppose the amendment. Is there further discussion? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 3, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with a minority. Without objection, it is so ordered. If the staff will please pass out en bloc package number 3. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. En bloc package number 3 is comprised of the following. Amendment 58R1 by Ms. Duckworth, which requires DOD to provide report on headquarters downsizing. Amendment 119R1 by Mr. Lamborn, which increases funding for U.S.-Israel anti-tunneling defense systems. Amendment 138R1 by Mr. Whitman, which increases funding for facilities, sustainment, restoration, and modernization. Amendment 154 by Mr. Franks, which expresses a sense of Congress and provides support for the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga. Amendment number 168R1 as revised by Mr. O'Rourke, which requires the DOD to submit a report on preventing future terrorist organizations in Syria and Iraq. Amendment number 193 by Mr. Kaufman, which amends directive report language on the National Commission on the Future of the Army. Amendment number 219 by Mr. Forbes, which directs Northcom to provide a report on redeployment of existing JLIN systems. Amendment number 277R1 by Mr. Hunter, which strikes Section 1087 and replaces it, with requirements regarding the Global Cultural Network. Amendment number 294R1 by Ms. Hartzler, which adds $20 million to the procurement of ammunition, Army production base support, and industrial facilities. And Amendment number 306 by Mr. Whitman, which amends a museum name in the section to Cyber Center for Education and Innovation, home of the National Cryptological Museum. That trips off the tongue. Is there further discussion on the en bloc package? Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to call the committee's attention to my amendment within this en bloc package, which would require the Secretary of Defense to provide to us a detailed description of the conditions that would have to be met for ISIS to be considered defeated. It would also require the Secretary to define the political, economic, and security conditions that would provide reasonable confidence that a successor to al-Qaeda or ISIS would not form in the region. And then I think most importantly, the Secretary would have to provide a strategy to facilitate those political, economic, and security conditions. It's too bad that more than 25 years since the Gulf War, this is the 4th consecutive administration that's used military force in Iraq. The next will be the 5th. It's too bad that 15 years after the 2001 AUMF, we are still using it to conduct military strikes in Iraq and Syria. It's too bad that just a few years after we withdrew forces from Iraq in 2011, we were fighting the successor to al-Qaeda in that country. What would be worse and I think unforgivable would be for us to defeat ISIS militarily, but not to prevent the conditions for its successor, and to have the United States return and use military force and put our service members into harm's way in that country again. So I think it's critically important that we define what victory looks like, how we sustain that, and how we ensure that we are not back there again in the future. So I look forward to working with this committee to hold this and the future Secretaries of Defense accountable for fulfilling the provisions of this requirement. And with that, I yield back.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is on the amendments in en bloc package number 3. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment on the table.
If the staff would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in 2014, there was a 2-year authorization for the Syria Train and Equip program that was really snuck into a must-pass funding bill where we had no standalone vote, no real debate on the issue. I and many others voted against that bill then, and we saw that program turn out really to be a colossal failure. Yet included in the underlying bill is more money and an extension of this Syria Train and Equip program for another year. It's been widely reported that now our U.S. Special Forces are only, quote, vetting and training the commanders of so-called moderate Syrian opposition forces, and then going on and equipping their entire brigades, thousands of people who've not been vetted or screened in any way. By continuing to funnel weapons to the so-called moderate opposition in Syria, whose loyalties are questionable, and whose so-called moderate forces are virtually indistinguishable from al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, we see the result is strengthening our enemy. Right now, there are 2 wars that the U.S. is waging in Syria. The first is the war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, which we should end. Second is the war to defeat ISIS, which should include al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, and which we must win. This provision is another avenue for the administration to fuel the illegal counterproductive war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, a war that Congress has not authorized, and which actually results in helping our enemy, ISIS and al-Qaeda, reach their objective of taking over all of Syria. This war to overthrow the Syrian government that we've been waging and supporting has been the cause of tremendous loss of life, millions of refugees, and strengthening groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS. I've introduced separate legislation that would end that war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, and I encourage my colleagues to support it. The amendment before my colleagues today simply strikes the language from the underlying bill and stops the reauthorization of this program, and I urge my colleagues' support. Thank you.
I yield to myself, and please start the clock. Just to be clear, what the underlying bill does is to authorize the DOD's train and equip program in Syria to fight ISIS. It does not contain any money to do that. It basically says that DOD has got to reprogram any money, and that helps us keep a check on and to help govern how that goes and whether progress is being made. I think there are a lot of criticisms that can legitimately be made about the Syria train and equip effort so far, and I don't dispute any of them. But at a very simplistic level, it seems to me there are three options here. One is for the U.S. to send troops in to defeat ISIS. Another is for us to try to develop partners to defeat ISIS. And the third is to just let ISIS go. Now, there are downsides in all three of those options, but I don't see another one other than train partners, do it ourselves, or not worry about it. Of course, not worrying about it means we'll have to worry about it more later. So I believe we should authorize a train and equip program. I believe we should keep our finger as close as we can on the pulse of how that's going. We've had General McFarland before our committee to talk about his view of this, and he believes that this authority is necessary. But at the same time, we need to keep pushing the administration to have a strategy that actually, and this goes back to something that Mr. O'Rourke was just saying, successfully degrades and destroys ISIS and has a plan for maintaining it so we don't have to come in and do this again. So that's my view, and I yield back 5 seconds. Mr. Conaway.
Thanks, Chairman. I would just add to your comments that this doesn't start till October 1st. By leaving 1221 in place, it leaves allows the Department of Defense to maintain certain relationships and keep in place the options for the new administration that will be coming in January, because this isn't going to get fixed in any time soon, and the new administration, whichever party is in place, ought to have the option of taking a fresh look at what's going on. And by keeping 2112 in there, 1221, seems to me we've struck a good balance of making sure the reprogramming, the money that comes up has to go through you and the PROPS folks, but it also maintains or allows the Department of Defense to maintain relationships they've crafted through this vetting process during this transition to a new administration. So I would respectfully disagree with the lady's amendment and urge to not adopt it. Now you're back.
Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Chairman, I share my colleague from Hawaii's concerns about the train and equip program. I'm also concerned that the program that is being implemented today is different than the one in many respects that was first authorized by Congress. And in both public and private classified discussions, my concerns have not been sufficiently addressed. I think this is something that would benefit from a larger discussion, much more sober deliberation by the entire Congress and the country before we move forward on something that I don't think has been fully thought through. With that, I will yield the remainder of my time to my colleague from Hawaii.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to offer this. I looked very carefully through all of the existing language in the underlying measure and could not find anything that limited these forces to targeting ISIS. And I found multiple references to both ISIS and the Syrian government. I think it'd be a different conversation if that language was, if I saw that language here. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that we do need local ground forces in order to defeat ISIS that our special forces can work with. My point here is that we should be working with trusted partners who we know have been effective, who are committed to fighting against ISIS, people like the Kurds in both Syria and Iraq, some of the Arab coalition partners. We should not be providing arms to forces who have not been vetted, who we don't know who they are, and whose loyalties lie somewhere between overthrowing the Assad government and fighting against ISIS. There are far too many vague issues here that have not been clarified. and the language remains a problem for that reason.
Dr. Fleming.
Yeah, I have a question, Mr. Chairman, for you. When this came up for a vote 2 years ago, I opposed it. I voted against it because it didn't make sense to me. The whole program just sounded ridiculous. I recall that there was like $500 million programmed for it. So where is the money now? You said that this only authorizes, but I know there was a lot of money included in this originally, and a lot has been spent thus far.
With gentleman yield.
Yes.
There was some money spent. Some of it was not successful. Some of it was more successful. And then some of it was not spent. I hesitate a little because to get into too much detail in open session gets somewhat difficult, but I'd be happy to have further conversations with the gentleman about it. But where we are now is to spend money in this effort, it has to be money that is reprogrammed, and that gives us a greater oversight step by step as it goes forward.
If I could ask one other question, do we have to vote on that reprogramming, or is that something that DOD?
It is not something that the full committee votes on. That is, as Mr. Conaway said, that's something that goes through the leadership of this committee and also the Appropriations Committee and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Other discussion on the amendment, Mr. Scott?
Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, as you know, I've opposed this funding in the past because the President has not given us a strategy for defeating ISIS, and I just wonder, as we get to the floor, if we're going to spend this money, that maybe the President ought to actually deliver a strategy to Congress and to the United States government on how we're going to defeat ISIS. With that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of really quick points. I think that it was the chairman who said that Lieutenant General McFarland has told us in this committee that this authority is necessary for the counter-ISIL fight in Syria, and I'm very confident that the chairman, as he looks at these reprogramming efforts, will make sure that that effort is properly focused. And we do have troops on the ground there in Iraq, in Syria, and if the commander says that this authority would be helpful, that he needs it, we ought to give it to him. I yield back.
Further discussion. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard. Those in favor of the amendment say aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, call for a recorded vote.
Gentlelady from Hawaii asked for a recorded vote, which will be postponed. Gentleman from Massachusetts have an amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Staff would please distribute the amendment. Thank you. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would remove the unfortunate narrowing of eligibility requirements included in the MARC, which would prevent hundreds of Afghans whose lives are at risk because of their work for our country from even being considered for resettlement in the United States. The narrowing of eligibility intentionally excludes hundreds of Afghans applying to the special SIV program who worked for the State Department, USAID, U.S. security contractors, or a number of other capacities, many of whom face well-documented death threats due to their work with our government, regardless of whether that was with frontline troops or on an American base. Indeed, it can be easier for the enemy to track Afghans who commute daily to U.S. bases as opposed to those who are embedded with our frontline infantry platoons. These are people who have put their lives on the line, not just for their country, but for ours. For that risk and sacrifice, the very least we can offer is for them a chance to stay alive, to keep living, rather than abandoning them to the same enemies they united with us to destroy. Though my amendment does not address the need to raise the numeric quota for visa issuance, I am equally frustrated by the MARC's failure to address this urgent need. As we sit here today, there are 10,300 Afghans who have submitted applications via the special immigrant visa process, yet there are only 4,000 visas left remaining to be allocated. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow members of the Armed Services Committee, we are leaving over 6,000 individuals in imminent danger. I understand that due to jurisdictional limitations, we cannot presently consider either an amendment raising the numeric quota on available visas or this amendment addressing eligibility criteria, but I intend to file amendments addressing these issues for consideration on the House floor. One of the things I was most proud of as a Marine infantry officer is that we never let our enemies compromise our values. One of those values is a solemn commitment to the allies, to our allies, and to our brothers in arms. I urge your support on the floor in following through on our commitment to thousands of Afghans who served with us. With that, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this amendment, Mr. Gibson, Mr. Larson, Ms. Songus, Mr. Peters, and Ms. Stefanik. I withdraw the amendment and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and I would like to have a further conversation with the gentleman on this topic. I think there's another dimension that we need to talk about, and I do want to do that. Next, Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I'd like to take up Amendment 334 first here.
Okay, Mr. Garamendi seeks to offer Amendment 334. If y'all would distribute that amendment, please. Without objection, the amendment's considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. For the last 45 minutes or so, we've been dancing around the issue of Iraq and Syria, the role of the United States, whether we could or should arm and assist, and how we ought to be dealing with it. We've heard comments that we have no strategy, we have no plan, or we do have a plan and it's not working. What's not working is the Congress of the United States. What's not working is the Congress of the United States carrying out its constitutional responsibility to wage war. We've allowed the President to rely on a 2001 authorization to use force in Afghanistan to deal with al-Qaeda and related. By a stretch of some legal imagination, that is now the only justification for our action in Iraq and Syria, or the only legal foundation for that. And so it's very difficult for the military, for the President to develop a plan when it is so far removed from the legal foundation. So this amendment that I'm proposing here is the President's request to the Congress of the United States for an authorization to use force in Iraq and Syria. That's what it is. That's what we ought to be doing. And instead of dancing around this issue and humming and hawing, we ought to come to grips with our own responsibility that I think all of us undertook when we got this job and we swore ourselves to obey the Constitution. So that's what it is. It's fairly simple. It gives authorization to the administration, the Department of Defense, and the President to go after ISIS in those two countries for a limited period of time, 3 years, and here we are. The House Armed Services Committee that presumably deals with this issue, except for the one thing that we are required to do, or at least one of the other things we're required to do, in addition to the defense of the nation. I yield back my time. Mr. Chairman.
As gentleman knows, this committee does not have jurisdiction over this issue. I don't believe that the Foreign Affairs Committee has waived jurisdiction. Therefore, it is not possible for us to consider this amendment. I'm sympathetic, actually. I think the Congress ought to deal with it, but it is not in this committee's jurisdiction to do so, and therefore we will not be able to consider the amendment. For a purpose, gentleman from North Carolina, right?
I would like to ask the chairman a question on this issue that Mr. Garamendi has brought before us. Many of us have asked that we have this ability to meet our constitutional duty. If we would, a group of us, Republicans and Democrats, would write the Speaker of the House and ask that he meet with you and the committee chairman from the Foreign Relations Committee to discuss the possibility of bringing forward a AUMF. Would you consider that, sir?
Well, I would say I have met with the Speaker on this. He would like to bring it forward. And he has commissioned the chairman of Foreign Affairs, and I have set in, as well as the majority leader, to some listening sessions to see what might be possible for us to vote on and pass. And so there have been several of those. So I certainly encourage the gentleman to send whatever letters he thinks appropriate to the Speaker. I know he's sympathetic with that, but at this point, his view is that we do not yet have a majority on any particular proposal, and he wants to continue to work to see if we can find one.
I will yield my time
Chairman,
back to the gentleman from
thank you.
California.
Appreciate that. Thank you. This is an inquiry as to the rules of this committee and perhaps the rules beyond the committee. Do we have the power within this committee to waive the rule on jurisdiction?
No.
Well, there's two different rules.
We could do tax reform and all sorts of things if we could do that.
Well, we could probably do that, but my understanding is there's two different rules. One is the committee rule dealing with this issue of jurisdiction, and the other is the House rule as to who has what responsibility. It seems to me that we could have the opportunity to take this up and, under our own volition, pass out an AUMF, and then it would be double referred over to the other committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Well, here's my suggestion. If the gentleman would like to offer an amendment when this bill goes to the floor, I suggest he offer it and do so. But the situation is our bill would not go to the floor with an amendment which had some provision that the Committee of Jurisdiction had not waived on. And so that is the reason that for 54 straight years, a NDAA has been signed into law, because we adhere to those restrictions. Otherwise, we simply, as I say, we can do tax reform or all sorts of things theoretically, but we can never get the bill to the floor.
Mr. Chairman, I think what, John, if I may, I think what you're saying, we could theoretically do a separate bill, but we don't want to attach it to this one because there's quite a few other things in there and it would die over in the Foreign Affairs Committee. We could theoretically, as a committee, do a separate bill. And that would be referred to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Is that not correct?
Well, let's do it.
I think.
Not tonight.
But I really
Chairman,
don't think.
I withdraw my motion.
I really don't think we even have a hook of jurisdiction, but I don't know, the lawyer's going to have to work on that, whether there's even a hook.
Isn't war sufficient jurisdiction?
I'm sorry? We don't know. Yeah. No, we all deal with what we have. Okay, the amendment is withdrawn. And does the gentleman choose not to offer Amendment 319? Is that right?
No, I do offer it.
Okay, the staff will distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make this one much quicker than the last discussion, although it's a discussion we ought to have. This amendment basically deals with the present situation, the arm and support in Syria, and basically says that unless we have an AUMF 1 year after the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, the authority to arm and support the rebels in Syria is terminated. Pretty close to what we've already done with the overall funding in the legislation. I'll make it quick, less than 1 minute. Final word. Every single one of us is responsible for war, 535 of us, and the President's responsible for conducting the war. We're the ones that said we're going to go to war or we're not going to go to war, and we are surely at war in Iraq and Syria. And it's our responsibility to lay down an AUMF, put the parameters in place, give the authority that's necessary, and let the President conduct the war. We're not doing that. We're abdicating our responsibility. And much of what we have here as we complain about what goes on in Iraq and Syria, too much, too little, comes down to our fault by not describing what it is that we want to be done in that area. So I'm going to withdraw this amendment, but I'm not going to let this issue go by. We will take it up on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 322 at the desk.
If the staff would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and gentlelady from California is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Due to some referral issues, I'll be offering and withdrawing this amendment, Mr. Chairman. So this is a sense of Congress on violations of human rights by the military of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a country we currently support through military training programs, even though they have a poor history of human rights. According to Human Rights Watch, Azerbaijan has escalated repression against its critics, leading to politically motivated arrests of journalists, activists, and bloggers. In 2004, Ramil Safarov murdered an Armenian officer during a NATO Partnership for Peace training program. Azerbaijan, instead of bringing that killer to justice, promoted him and threw him a celebration. Most recently, Azerbaijan acted upon a long-stated threat to attack Nagorno-Karabakh, which claimed lives on both sides. And during this period of hostilities, there have been reports of human rights violations committed by the Azerbaijani military. I believe that these blatant human rights violations warrant action on our part to direct our Secretary of Defense to work with our Secretary of State on an investigation into possible human rights violations. And I believe that the United States should conduct an investigation on whether the Leahy Law is being violated by Azerbaijani military. We, the United States, we are a leader on human rights, and we cannot afford to support militaries that commit human rights violations. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, I have worked on, over the last 20 years, on human rights with respect to other countries. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I withdraw my amendment.
Amendment is withdrawn. Ranking member has an amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Staff would please distribute the amendment, number 251.
Are you keeping track of how many of these you're passing out?
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the ranking member is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a very familiar issue, so I will be brief. This is basically lifting the prohibitions that are in the bill from closing Guantanamo. This has been a long fight. I strongly feel that we should close Guantanamo. There are 80 detainees left there at the moment. I think we can house them here in the United States at very safe facilities and close what is and continues to be an international eyesore and what is also unbelievably expensive. I forget the exact dollar figure. It's been estimated anywhere between $2 million and $5 million per inmate per year. That number only goes up as the number goes down. There are, I think, many compelling reasons for closing this. Once upon a time, George W. Bush supported closing it. John McCain supported closing it. It is something that I think needs to be done, and therefore I am offering an amendment that would take away the prohibitions that are contained in this bill that stop that from happening. As I said, we've had this debate many times before. I will not go on at length, but I do believe that we should close the prison and we should enable the President the flexibility to do so. And with that, I yield back.
I'll yield to myself just to remind everybody, in last year's NDAA, we told the administration, okay, if you want to close Gitmo, give us a plan on how you're going to do it. Well, they sent us about 7 pages that didn't say very much. And as a matter of fact, it said, well, there's about 13 different places we might put them. We asked them to give us a plan on what they're going to do with future detainees. Their answer was, well, we've got several options. My conclusion is the administration is having a hard time coming up with an implementation plan on how they would close Guantanamo, where they would move those detainees, and what they intend to do with future detainees. So without a better plan, my view is that what we're doing now is needs to continue, and that includes the same restrictions that have been in law basically since the Democrats were a majority in both the House and the Senate. They've remained in place all that time for all of those reasons, and basically we've continued them in this mark. Gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Walorski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to add one other thing. I agree with the chairman. Let's not forget the recidivism rate from these high-risk terrorists, the worst of the worst in the world that have already had American blood on their hands is 30%, well over 30%. We're reading about these guys every day in the news. There isn't a week that goes by when there's not somebody who's been released back in action and aiming to kill our fellow Americans. So I agree, this is the safest place for them and for the American people. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I may. Sure. Just quickly, I'm not talking about letting them go. We're simply talking about housing them in maximum security, safe facilities here in the U.S. I just want to be clear on that point. Yield back.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. His amendment also does do away with Section 1034, which does talk about the transferring of Gitmo detainees to foreign countries and other foreign entities. And currently, law says that SecDef has to have a written certification to Congress before 30 days before the transfer, making sure that it's in the interest of the United States, making sure that the receiving country is not a state sponsor of terrorism. It will maintain control, make sure that they don't re-engage. So this amendment goes far more than just talking about transferring them here, and I would ask everyone to please oppose this amendment.
Sorry, it's okay. Keep clarification. I don't get rid of all of the restrictions on transfers, just the transfer restrictions that we added into last year's bill. Anyone transferred out of Gitmo still has to be certified as eligible for release and safe and a bunch of different things. I forget what all the requirements are. But this does not give carte blanche to the administration to release anyone they want to release. It just removes the added restrictions that were put into last year's bill.
Which were added as a result of the illegal Taliban 5 transfer where the administration violated the law. Okay, I think we're about done on this. I agree. Okay. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter, have an amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
If the staff would please distribute the amendment.
It's not bellicose. There'll be no bellicosity.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is pretty simple. It fences 15% of OSD policy funds until the SecDef establishes an updated arming policy for service members on military installations, including recruiting centers, which we required in last year's NDAA. It was supposed to be done by December 31st of last year, and it was not. DOD has not complied with the FY16 NDAA requirement that required the SecDef to establish and implement a process by the end of last year where military commanders may authorize service members to carry appropriate firearms on military installations and recruiting centers for personal and force protection. DOD has updated its arming policy, but it's late. Given our interest in this and the fact that we put this in last year's NDAA, it was important then, it's important now, it's important because of Fort Hood, the Navy Yard, Chattanooga, and hopefully no more in the future. They're 4 months late in updating their policy, and this amendment simply holds the DOD accountable for updating their law or their policy as we required them to. Updated guidance will address security at over 17,000 DOD facilities, including over 400 military installations in the U.S. and 6,000 recruiting centers like Chattanooga. The fence is appropriately applied to OSD policy only, which is the section of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is responsible for developing and coordinating the updated policy. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Smith.
Just quickly, I oppose this amendment. They can submit the report and do all that, but fencing in Department of Defense money on this, I think, is a bit of overkill. Certainly, we should emphasize, yes, they should give us the report. Yes, they should give us the plan. But as we've heard over and over again, we don't want to tie the hands of the Department of Defense to do their best to provide for the men and women who serve in the military in all aspects of that. So fencing money over this, I think, is a little bit over the top.
Would the ranking member yield? Would the ranking member yield?
If Mr. Turner doesn't object, yes, I will.
I'll take 10 seconds. The reason I think it's important, the reason I think it's okay to fence money off, these are lives. These are soldiers' lives, sailors, Marines. These are their lives at stake. I mean, we had guys get killed. Right? I mean, that's why I think it's okay to fence it off in this case.
Right. If I may, reclaiming my time, it's debatable whether or not, and I realize, if I say this, I could start an enormous fight, but I'm going to say it anyway. The presence of even more firearms in a place may in fact not make that place safer, would be the argument. And that is what the military is trying to determine. So I agree with you, it's about lives, but it's debatable which way is more protective of those lives. I yield back.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Mr. Hunter, have another amendment?
I have another gun amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The staff would please distribute the amendment.
Mix this with the live animal stuff. We could hunt and shoot.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Gentleman, California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment provides military spouses with the same exceptions granted their active duty spouses for purchasing firearms. If you get a permanent change of station, a PCS, from if you live in Virginia and you get stationed at Camp Pendleton, you're not a California resident, you can still purchase a firearm in California. If you take in your orders to the gun store, show them your orders, the active duty military person can purchase a weapon, but their spouse can't. This amendment simply puts the spouses of active duty military members on the same grounds as the military members themselves. Here's an interesting, here's one reason I'm doing this. We spoke with a woman whose husband was identified on an ISIS kill list online. The woman had to work with the FBI and NCIS to get a California state ID for a weapons purchase, and even following this, she had issues obtaining a firearm. She was emotionally scarred by the incident, and the lack of an ability to purchase a gun immediately added to her distress and caused the family severe stress. We spoke with a wife whose husband was deployed, and there was a burglar in the neighborhood. The spouse was not able to purchase a firearm to protect herself due to current laws. If you're on active duty, you're going to be deployed. The people actually who should have the biggest inclination to be armed is the spouse who's not deployed, who's home by themselves with their kids or simply by themselves. I think this is extremely important for not just the safety, but the perceived safety that a spouse would have while their loved one is overseas. Our military spouses should not be denied the security that comes from the constitutional right to bear arms, and I ask for you to show your support for our military spouses by co-sponsoring and voting yes on my amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I think this is a very reasonable argument, and I agree with Mr. Hunter on this. I mean, if in fact this applies to the service member who basically has to be in a place other than their home state, it applies equally to the spouse who also has to be in that place other than their home state. So I have no objection to this amendment.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Gentleman from Hawaii.
Mr. Chairman, I have a amendment laying on the desk.
If the staff would please distribute the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment strikes Section 909 and 910 from the bill. I'm opposed to both sections and think they represent a piecemeal strategy to try and fix a problem that does not exist. While I understand that the department and this committee are under tremendous pressure to find savings and efficiencies wherever they can, this represents a marked departure from the previous policy that this committee has supported. And I must say that I'm a bit surprised that this committee would support degrading the command and control of our combatant commanders and consolidating it back to Washington, D.C. I believe every member of Congress needs to be concerned. Why are we doing this? What problem is this trying to fix? I see this degrading today's structure, which is actually working. Let's not forget why we created COCOMs in the first place. In every region, security challenges are complex, diverse, often non-traditional, and frequently interconnected. At each combatant command headquarters, these and other questions were addressed by enthusiastic and knowledgeable joint planners skilled in the art of military strategy. If there's anywhere that the DoD ought to operate jointly, it is at the 4-star headquarters level, and by undoing this structure, cost savings would be minor by Pentagon standards. I can tell you that this is especially true at U.S. Pacific Command, where day in and day out, men and women are working on our nation's top security challenge. Our nation sees the benefits of our engagements in the Asia-Pacific region, where we put forward some of the most critical and complex alliances and partnerships in the world. But I guess my bigger question, and I repeat, why are we doing this? And if it is to save costs, shouldn't we take a more data-driven approach before racing to assumptions and changes? At that point, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I yield to myself. The bottom line is this is a direction DoD is headed on its own. We are trying to facilitate some of the rearrangement of 3- and 4-star headquarters. It may well be that through the course of the next several weeks and months, as we continue to talk with them, that we want to make some adjustments here. But basically, the direction that we put into the mark is the direction that DOD is already headed. And as I say, we have been in conversations with them about this and will continue to be. So I'm sympathetic to the point the gentleman's making. We're not trying to arbitrarily pull out of thin air, okay, this many that to save some money. But we are trying, as part of the overall review that is going on at the department in some preliminary talks with them, to be consistent with that, and then to have something in our mark that we can continue to revise as that review progresses. So I don't want the gentleman to think that we sat down with a piece of paper and invented all this. This has been I won't say they agree with all this yet, but they are headed in this direction, subject to revision. And I want the gentleman to know that what we have in the bill is also subject to revision in consultation with DOD. Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Takai certainly for his service and understand his concerns here, but I want to support what the chairman just stated moments ago. I mean, personally, I think that we need to go much further when it comes to a post-Goldwater-Nichols reform, but moving towards consolidating headquarters, and I think we're too top-heavy right now, and quite candidly, with scarce resources, we need to prioritize, and I think we need leadership to do that. And so I support the direction we're going. So I respectfully ask for members to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there's no further, Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a pretty big difference between Section 909 and Section 910. 909 is really more about readiness. It allows a returning unit to reset and not be assigned to a COCOM. And that's important because it gives flexibility if they want to be assigned to a different unit. So that's important. And I agree with the gentleman from New York. We are too top-heavy. What's changed in battle is who's calling the shots and the authorities. My first operation, the execution checklist, a following of operations, was 6 lines. My last operation was over 5,000 different lines requiring multiple headquarters. As the decision to go to war is no longer a fleet commander's decision. It is going back. That is the way that the Department of Defense is headed. That is the way the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has reflected his view on controlling war. And we are too top-heavy. And so I think we are going to adjust as time goes by, but I oppose the amendment as written, and I wish it would have separated 909 and 910, but I do appreciate the author's work on it. I yield back the remaining part of my time.
Any further discussion? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Takai. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 4, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If the staff would please pass out the amendments. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. En bloc package number 4 comprises the following. Amendment number 12R1 by Mr. Klein that requires the Chief of Naval Operations to bring the defense committees on the investigation into the capture of 10 U.S. Navy sailors by Iran. Amendment number 41R1 by Mr. Takai that requires the Secretary of Defense to complete an update of the July 2011 assessment on the condition and capacity of public schools on military installations. Amendment number 52 by Mr. Jones that requires Secretary of Defense to determine and disclose transportation costs for congressional travel. Amendment number 65R1 by Mr. Zinke that adds a reporting element to the annual Russia military report. Amendment number 74R2 by Mr. Conaway that expresses expresses a sense of Congress that supports the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Amendment number 75R2 by Mr. Conaway that expresses a sense of Congress that reaffirms U.S. support for the state of Georgia. Amendment number 198R1 by Mr. Lamborn that adds a reporting element to the annual Iran military power report. Amendment number 215R1 by Mr. Forbes that expresses a sense of Congress that the Secretary of Defense should conduct a program of senior military exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan. Amendment number 216R1 by Mr. Forbes that requires Secretary of Defense to provide a quarterly report on U.S. freedom of navigation operations. Amendment number 226 by Mr. Moulton that requires Secretaries of Defense and State to submit to Congress an integrated political and military strategy to counter ISIS. Amendment number 270R1 by Mr. Kaufman that directs GAO to include in its FMS assessment the impacts of certain contracting types on the defense industrial base. Amendment number 278R2 by Dr. Heck that increases in line 66 by $7.5 million and reduces the amount for line 158 by $7.5 million. And Amendment number 295R1 by Ms. Hartzler that directs GAO to include 2 additional elements in its assessment of FMS. Is there further discussion on en bloc package number 4? Mr. Moulton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to speak briefly on the anti-ISIS campaign strategy amendment. This bipartisan amendment requires an integrated, unclassified, and classified counter-ISIS strategy from the Secretaries of Defense and State through a rigorous reporting requirement, including a military strategy and clear objectives of the Department of Defense and coalition partners against ISIS, as well as a political plan for Iraq and Syria. It requires a forward-looking strategy detailing the political and military integration of the anti-ISIS campaign that has, to date, been lacking. Members on both sides of the Armed Services Committee are supportive, and the Republican leadership of the Foreign Affairs Committee has been supportive of the amendment, contributed additional language, and waived jurisdiction for our committees to act. I, as were many other members of the committee, were frustrated by a lack of specificity and direction in the Section 1222 report required by last year's NDAA, a report which lacked a forward-looking strategy detailing both the political and military aspects of the campaign plan. In fact, whole of government is only mentioned 3 times in the report. After our calls for months for a clearer political strategy, this amendment addresses that need, and I urge all members to vote in support of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Further discussion on en bloc package number 4? If not, the question is on the en bloc package. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Gentlelady from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
If the staff would please distribute the amendment.
The stage grouse had died by then.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. And the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would strike a provision in the underlying bill regarding the greater sage grouse. Last fall, the Department of the Interior announced that thanks to unprecedented, proactive partnerships, the greater sage grouse does not need protections under the Endangered Species Act. Rather than supporting this partnership, legislation in the chairman's mark creates uncertainty and undermines the immense progress that is already underway to conserve sagebrush habitat while simultaneously providing predictability for economic development. Perhaps most significantly, allowing this language to move forward puts the greater sage grouse at risk of needing to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, which none of us want to see happen. According to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, this language is also completely unnecessary to protect military readiness or national defense. The Office of the Secretary of Defense has reviewed the sage-grouse resource management plans and concluded that they, quote, do not believe these plans will affect military training, operations, or readiness to any significant degree, unquote. Adding that, quote, we believe existing statutory authorities sufficiently protect the interests of the Department of Defense, and we do not anticipate the need for additional legislation from Congress, unquote. The Army says it, quote, does not believe that these plans will affect Army training, operations, or readiness to any significant degree, unquote. And the Air Force wrote that, quote, the management practices described would not affect Air Force training, operations, or readiness to any significant degree, unquote. And the Navy fully concurs with the response of the Department of Defense. These responses all demonstrate that this provision is not actually about military readiness, but instead an attempt to interfere with management of our nation's public lands and undermine the Endangered Species Act. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and reject riders that do not belong in the NDAA. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Utah.
You think I should? Yes, I'd like to speak to this.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
As my hero, Yogi Berra, once said, this is deja vu all over again. So you can remember maybe last year with the roll call editorial that said, yeah, this is a problem and it's a significant one, or the Stars and Stripes editorial that said, yeah, this is a problem and a significant one, or the report from the Navy that said, yeah, this is a problem and a significant one, or the Air Force, which said the same thing, or the Army, which had their report, or the one they updated this year that said not only is it still a problem, they're spending $28 million this year, or maybe the proclama that Secretary Ash put out before the conference where he said all the things he didn't like in the mark. Not one word about the sage-grouse language or prairie chicken language was in there. The silence was deafening with that report. The thing that is different today is you've seen a couple of letters that have been sent out to you from the political appointees within the Pentagon. I want you to read between the lines because even though these are personal letters that are not policy of the Pentagon, it is still very vague. For example, the one from the Secretary said they are believing existing statutory authorities are okay and they would not anticipate a need, but they will continue to monitor. And the one I really like is because they sent one out from the Air Force, but they didn't send you out the next line in the letter, which said, however, the forecast of no adverse impact could change with the potential implementation of new management practices, which is exactly what will happen this fall. The difference between this year and last year is the sage-grouse was thought of being listed last year. It's not. Instead, BLM is going to institute this fall management plans that would be as if the sage-grouse were listed, which creates the exact management problems the Air Force letters send out tells you about. So I'm asking you to read between the lines between what the professionals are saying and what the political appointees are saying, because already the Army has lost some of its range in the Northwest. Already the Air Force in Idaho has had to change their policies to do it. This is a problem. Vote no, like the Army told you to last year.
Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Massachusetts.
Yes, thank you for that. I'd just like to address the issue of the official nature of these letters. These letters have been fully released to the public. They're in no way private. I have them here with me. They were written on official letterhead and were signed by the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Would the gentlelady yield to a question?
The Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for the Environment, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy, and the Environment, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations. The branches of our military all agree that language in the chairman's mark is not necessary to protect military readiness. And the other underlying issue is this is an unprecedented partnership, all designed to keep the greater sage-grouse from being listed. And the language in the underlying bill really undermines that progress, that partnership that is so focused on, as I said, keeping a listing from taking place. Well, thank you, and I yield back to Mr. Garamendi.
I yield back.
Mr. Nugent.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman, Mr. Bishop.
It's not going to be 2 minutes. The military told us, really, these are still private letters. These are not official policy of the Pentagon. They are personal letters sent to two individuals done on that stationery. It's not the policy. The policy is still in the reports that were sent out the year before that have not changed. The issue is not listing, it is the BLM management plan as if they were listed. That is the problem. So get the issue correct. It is the potential plans that will go into effect this fall if we do not allow the state plans, which is what this amendment does, to take consideration. The bird will still be protected because the state plans do it, but the states simply also take into account the encroachment areas around these installations and over the airspace that's used. Yield back.
Ms. Spear.
We need a moment of levity here, maybe. I fear that the greater sage grouse must have threatened our national security, or I suppose committed crimes most foul. Otherwise, why would my colleagues still be complaining, grousing about this harmless bird? Debate on this provision once again resembles the famous dance of the sage grouse. The male sage grouses puff up their chests, display tail feathers, and bob their heads. It's really worth watching it on a video. Female sage grouses apparently find this appealing, but the American people do not. The greater sage grouse is already protected under a massive collaborative effort between the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service, state agencies, private landowners, and other partners. Because of this hard work, the Fish and Wildlife Service has said that the bird does not need protection under the Endangered Species Act, even if the sage grouse was listed under the Endangered Species Act. The military has said that it is perfectly capable of maintaining readiness while also protecting the endangered species that occur on its lands. Members, this is not about the sage grouse. This is not about installations. This is about oil. I yield back. And I urge all my colleagues to vote for Congresswoman Tsongas's.
Oil.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No!
Opinion of the chair, noes have it.
Request the yeas and nays.
Gentlelady from Massachusetts requests a roll call vote, which will be postponed. Let's see, gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Waltz.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The staff will please distribute the amendment.
I got to do my best passive-aggressive here. Conway's coming back at me with a second-level amendment. Okay, see if I can get him. Shane. We'll win this one.
Thank you. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to offer an amendment to strike Section 311 of the underlying bill. I'd like to thank Mr. Peters and Mr. Ashford, and as a few hours ago, the majority of this committee for standing up for American-grown energy and a smart all-of-the-above energy policy. This amendment does away with the provision that would prevent DOD from taking advantage of American-growing energy. On every single day in this country, we send $500 million getting imported oil from countries that hate us. They will do it for free. Reducing our dependency on foreign oil is not just an economic issue, it's a vital national security issue. The Department of Defense recognizes that, and that's why some of the most groundbreaking work on renewable energy is happening within DOD. Hamstringing our ability to use all of our resources to make ourselves energy independent makes no sense. Section 311 goes against the Department of Defense cost-competitive efforts to diversify fuel sources, reduce reliance on foreign sources of energy. I commend DOD and USDA for public-private venture and join American Farm Bureau and the National Farmers Union in making this a critical issue of American independence. Just a brief background on this. In 2011, a memorandum of understanding between the Navy, USDA, and Department of Energy initiated a cooperative effort to support the production of drop-in replacement biofuels meeting military specifications. The Navy and USDA announced their Farm to Fleet initiative in December 2013. USDA uses Commodity and Credit Corporation Authority to provide assistance for the Department and the Navy to purchase advanced drop-in biofuels. In 2015, DOD made its first bulk purchase of the 10% biofuel blend for operational purposes. With the support of USDA, the cost of the blended fuel was less than the cost of the least expensive conventional fuel purchased under the same solicitation. This effort is one piece of a broader strategy. The Department of Defense should not be hamstrung by interest on one energy source when we have the ability to use them all. I encourage my colleagues to do what you just did a few hours ago and restate that we want to have all of the above American energy. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway.
I have a substitute amendment at the desk.
Staff will please distribute the substitute amendment.
We already voted on it. You look good. You look a lot smarter. You do.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, gentlemen. Current NDAA in which we're operating under has a provision in it that requires the Department of Defense to not spend money on operational and maintenance funds to buy fuels that are in excess of the cost of conventional fuels. What they have done is gone to the USDA and done an end run around this committee, which I think voted for that NDAA last year almost unanimously, to have that to be the provision. All the conversations earlier we had today about O&M and the readiness issue and all those kind of things, Department of Defense has colluded with USDA to avoid complying with the rules under existing NDAA we're currently under. So this rule simply says that the substitute actually is tougher than the section that Mr. Walls wanted to strike, in that not only does it get at the 17 funds that are going at it, it goes at any funds that have yet to be spent under this deal. So it's a way to cause the Department of Defense to obey the law that's currently in place under the NDAA to only buy fuels that are cost competitive. They would not be cost competitive without the USDA buying down the excess cost per gallon on these fuels. It's taxpayer dollars at the end of the day that are being spent in a wasteful manner. We've had numerous instances where we've got readiness issues and operational issues that are not being met, and yet we continue to spend money that we don't have for things that are important on things that better left to the Department of Energy. So this amendment simply says that they can't go around the current NDAA and buy down fuels by using other taxpayer dollars that aren't under their control. I urge my colleagues to encourage the Department of Defense to obey the law and adopt my substitute. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose a substitute amendment that would prevent the Department of Defense from continuing its collaborative work with the Department of Agriculture to provide biofuels for the military. The United States Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of energy in the world, and as we've seen in recent years, our global markets are volatile. Despite massive domestic production increases, which has been mentioned before, last year our net imports of petroleum were nearly 5 billion barrels per day, with our top 5 suppliers being Canada, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia. Just because the price of oil is low today does not mean it won't spike tomorrow and force military leaders to divert resources away from mission priorities. In some cases, this has meant turning ships around and cutting their voyages short because of budgeting issues around fuel. At a time when we face new and dynamic threats from non-state actors like ISIS and aggression from China and Russia, this inhibits our ability to provide for a robust national defense. Presented with this challenge, the military has chosen to enter into a partnership with the USDA to source an alternative, cost-competitive, American-made fuel source for our warfighters. Our military needs the flexibility to diversify its fuel supply however it sees fit to enhance readiness and reduce costs. I was a supporter of my friend Mr. Walsh's amendment to strike Section 311 of the bill to allow the Department of Defense to continue working with the Department of Agriculture to improve energy security and make our military a stronger, more effective fighting force. And now I urge my colleagues to oppose this substitute amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Further discussion on the substitute? If not, the question is on, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just remind all of our colleagues that you can't run a ship on biofuel, and you also cannot fly airplanes on biofuel. You can certainly not do it in a cost-effective manner. In the last decade, we've seen approximately 13 weeks of fuel provided for 10 years' worth of effort. When it comes to some of these provisions, it is not cost-effective. Natural gas, on the other hand, and petroleum, are vital to our national defense, regardless what our domestic use may or may not be. You cannot operate heavy military equipment and many of the other things. Fine, put solar panels, turn on the lights on an installation, but if we're going to use examples about the high-performance military equipment that we use, then we need to have a little truth in lending, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Other debate? Gentleman, Mr. Lamborn.
Chairman, I yield my time to my colleague from Texas.
Just quickly, this is no different than what you and I are driving up down the street, checking to make sure we're getting the best gasoline price when we buy. We don't go into a station and pay an extra 20 cents a gallon when the station across the street is less than that. This is all we're talking about doing. This is operational and maintenance money. This is buying fuel to run the ships and planes or whatever it is day in and day out. And it's just a matter of saying to the Department of Defense, get the best bargain you can get. It's not about development. It's not about research. It's not about testing. It's not about certification. It's about operating day in and day out at a most cost-efficient manner where we are. The other issues about, the ship's running out of fuel because it can't buy it, well, paying more for it than we could on the conventional basis doesn't make any sense either. The comments about imported oil, ignore the facts that over the last 4 years, the American oil producer on private property has continued to expand U.S. production to the point that we're now able to export that production. And so with shale oil and shale gas, we've got immense resources to be able to use. And at a time where we are not properly funding our men and women, we have men and women who aren't flying the number of hours they need to fly every day in order to be proficient and a cutting edge when they go into combat. That ought to be considered criminal for us to do that. And by spending extra dollars that the Department of Defense doesn't have simply to assuage the President's green energy initiatives is just wrong. And all due respect to Mr. Walls, it's inappropriate to spend money like that, which you wouldn't do out of your own pocket if you were spending it. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Takai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to my good friend from Minnesota, Mr. Waltz.
Well, first of all, I do use biofuels from that, so I do make that decision myself. Secondly, we do power our military vehicles with them. Certainly not our nuclear submarines, but others we are using it on. The question on this is the least cost-effective is imported oil from Saudi Arabia and putting us at risk from that, why we have the opportunity here. I would not offer an amendment to ask us not to do research into fossil fuels to make them more efficient and use them. We should use all of them. This is clearly trying to cut out one issue of where we're making progress, we're growing it at home, we're using it in our vehicles, the Navy's asking for it, it's making us more secure, it's creating jobs here at home. All those things we want to do. It may be a geographic issue, and yes, for full disclosure, whatever, I do grow corn there. But I'm glad that there's oil in other places and we're using that too. Why would we cut off and use this? And the cost issue, that is simply disingenuous to say there aren't costs afforded to that and we're sending the money overseas. So the thing I would ask all of you is, you already voted on this once earlier tonight. It is nothing different. It is the same language coming back. We had that opportunity before to say that we should create energy at home, American energy, American security, and allow the Navy and the Department of Defense to create these unique partnerships that we're seeing things move forward in, and we are using it right now, and it makes sense. So you voted on it once. I ask you to vote on it again. I ask us to give us an opportunity in this nation to continue the research into this. This stops anything we've been doing, and we can't move forward. And we're making breakthroughs almost yearly as it comes to advanced biofuels. I yield back.
Question is, I'm sorry, who's seeking? Ms. Spear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to read to you from Wikipedia a reference to Solazyme, which is a company in my district that makes fuel from algae and has a contract with the U.S. Navy. On November 7, 2011, United Airlines flew the world's first commercial aviation flight on a microbially-derived biofuel using Solajet, Solazyme's algae-derived renewable jet fuel. United also signed a letter of intent with Solazyme to purchase up to 20 million gallons per year of renewable jet fuel starting in 2014. The product is a mix of 40% algae-based and 60% petroleum-based. Solazyme officials said it sold the fuel to the United at the same cost as regular jet fuel. I yield back and I support the amendment.
Now the question is on the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway. Those in favor of the substitute amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And Mr. Walsh requests a roll call vote, which we have to take right now. So the question is on the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, number 221R2. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez. Yes. Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Forbes. Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Ms. Davis. Ms. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper. No. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mrs. Bordillo. Ms. Bordillo votes no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Conway. Mr. Conway votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Dr. Fleming. Dr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Gibson. Mr. Gibson votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke votes no. Dr. Heck. Dr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego. Is okay. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Takai. Mr. Takai votes no. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent votes aye. Ms. Graham. Ms. Graham votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Ashford. Mr. Ashford votes no. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mrs. Worlorski. Mrs. Walorski votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Mr. Higai? Pardon? Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. MacArthur?
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 31 ayes and 31 noes.
The substitute is not agreed to. The question is now on the underlying Waltz amendment. Question is on the underlying Waltz amendment. Those in favor of the Waltz amendment will say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Minnesota asked for a roll call vote, and we will postpone that. We can postpone that vote to the other votes at the end of the chairman's mark. As y'all understand, we had to go ahead and deal with the substitute before we knew what we were dealing with. So we can now roll the underlying Waltz amendment. Okay. Ms. Gabbard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The staff will please distribute the amendment. Thank you. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be offering and withdrawing this amendment due to a cross-referral to a different committee, but it's such an important issue, I'd like to say a couple of brief words on this. We all know clean drinking water is the most critical resource that a community has, and when you destroy that drinking water, you destroy the community. In 2014 in Honolulu, 27,000 gallons of jet fuel leaked from an underground Navy fuel storage facility there called Red Hill. That facility sits above multiple aquifers, which provide a significant percentage of drinking water to the residents of the island of Oahu. Since that time, the Navy's taken steps to monitor the water and is working with the EPA and our Department of Health to replace the tanks, but they're still detecting unusual compounds in the water there that are not regulated by the EPA. The EPA regulates water contaminants based on two factors. First, the risk they pose to health and the likelihood that the contaminant will appear in drinking water across the country. So a chemical that gets into drinking water simply because of a spill or an accident won't meet that standard because it's not naturally occurring. So some might call that the definition of a contaminant. My colleague, Congressman Dan Kildee, the representative of Flint, Michigan, knows firsthand the difficulties and hardships a community can experience when they don't have access to clean drinking water. Residents in another part of his district, near the former Wirt Smith Air Force Base, have seen petrofluorinated chemicals in their drinking water due to firefighting materials that the Air Force used in the past when the base was still open. These chemicals, PFCs, are not regulated by the EPA, but that doesn't mean that they don't potentially pose harm to our health. In the case of the old Wurtsmith Air Force Base, there is evidence that these PFCs may pose a significant health risk to humans, including kidney and liver damage, low birth rate, delayed puberty onset, elevated cholesterol levels, and reduced immunological responses to vaccines. In fact, in just February of this year, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the local health department, issued a joint health advisory stating that approximately 100 homeowners affected should, quote, seek an alternate water supply for drinking and preparation of food, end of quote. However, neither the state nor the Air Force have to date provided safe drinking water to those residents of the Oscoda community. This amendment authorizes the Department of Defense to provide alternative sources of drinking water in the event that DoD activities may have caused chemicals listed under EPA's third unregulated monitoring rule to enter the water. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady withdraws her amendment. Okay. Okay, the next amendment for consideration is an amendment filed by Ms. Sanchez, number 290R1. And I believe the gentlelady from California wishes to offer that amendment. Yes, please. If the staff, you have 290R1. Okay, I think, as y'all can tell, we're making some progress here. Without objection, Ms. Sanchez's amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go back to this chart that I showed you guys earlier about, this is the president's budget. The president's budget on the amount of money we're going to be spending from this red line here forward for the different pieces of the triad of our nuclear deterrent program. So this amendment is about a plus-up that was put in the chairman's mark of $317 million more than what the president asked for. So the plus-up is $317 more than the president's budget. My amendment would say to take that $317 million and put it directly to 3 unfunded requirements. $82.4 million for Patriot PAC-3 missiles for the Army, $76.6 million for counter-electronic attack upgrade kits for the F-18 aircraft, and $158 million for 2 additional KC-130J aircraft for the Marine Corps. All of these unfunded requirements will improve the readiness of our armed forces for combat. They are a far better use of funds than the unrequested plus-ups to the nuclear weapon accounts that this amendment scales back to the president's budget requests. And while the committee met other unfunded Army and Marine Corps requirements through the proposed chairman's mark, it did not address the requirements I just spoke up to: Patriot PAC-3 missiles for the Army, counter-electronic attack upgrade kits for the F-18 aircraft, and 2 additional KC-130J aircraft for the Marine Corps. I would ask my colleagues to please, let's put that money in readiness for our forces. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this amendment. 2 successive secretaries of Defense have said that the nuclear deterrence is the most important mission the department has. Secretary Hagel said, quote, "Our nuclear deterrent plays a critical role in assuring U.S. national security and its DOD's highest priority mission. No other capability we have is more important," close quote. Secretary Carter, quote, "The nuclear mission is the bedrock of our security. It is what stands in the background and looms over every action this country takes on the world stage. It is the foundation of everything we do," close quote. We need to be aware that this amendment would strike a $150 million increase the mark provides for addressing NNSA's massive $3.7 billion backlog in deferred maintenance. I want to remind everybody that MARC makes and takes good care of the service's needs while also taking good care of our nation's #1 priority defense mission, which is nuclear deterrence. Let's don't defer any of that money. And with that, I urge a no vote and yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
The president's budget was a reflection of the current budget that we agreed to a year ago, and it appropriated the money in a way that maximized the necessary programs. The plus-up that occurred in the chairman's mark went over and above what the military needed for the nuclear enterprise. The amendment that we have before us simply brings back to the president's budget level the appropriation or the authorization for these, I think, 10 different programs. It doesn't reduce below the president's budget, but what it does is to transfer that money that was over and above the president's budget into badly needed programs for the ongoing military operations. The Marine Corps, the Air Force, these are very important programs that are money coming from unnecessary expenditures at this time. We've already talked about the future of the nuclear enterprise. That's not what we're discussing right now. It's going to go forward. This is additional money that's not needed this next year for these nuclear weapons activities. And I'd strongly suggest that a couple of C-130s for the Marine Corps can be used much better than additional money not necessary to maintain the nuclear enterprise. So I would support this.
Further discussion on the amendment offered by Ms. Sanchez? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment I show is Mr. Garamendi 291R1. Gentlemen wish to offer that amendment?
I think it was just defeated. It was one of the programs that was in Mrs. Sanchez's. So I think we need not go there, although I could handily make the argument once again for 1 minute and 17 seconds, but I'll forego that. I'll withdraw the...
How about 299R1?
That one up. I have an amendment at the desk.
If the staff would please distribute 299R1 by Mr. Garamendi.
Up.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the gentleman without the microphone.
The one I wanted to take up was 291R1.
Okay, you do not want to offer 299?
That's correct.
Okay, sorry. Changed his mind. If y'all could, you can leave it there, it's okay. But if you would distribute 291R1. Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we've had discussions several times tonight about the nuclear enterprise and about the various elements of it. One of the new weapons that is in the process of being developed is the LSRO, long-range standoff weapon. This is a new cruise missile, both conventional and nuclear. The specific amendment that we're dealing with here is one part of that system. It is the nuclear bomb. There is a plus-up that is in the mark of some $21 million, over and above what is necessary to continue the development of the new modified W-80-4 nuclear bomb. We don't need this money now. In fact, I don't believe we need the missile, the cruise missile, and the weapon itself. It is in many ways redundant. The missile has been said to be extremely dangerous in that it creates uncertainty as to whether it is a conventional weapon or a nuclear weapon, because it can be either one of the two. And therefore, it's extraordinarily destabilizing. It is a replacement of an existing cruise missile that has a nuclear weapon associated with it. And so what I'm doing here is to remove the $21 million and directing that money to what is a more immediate need, which is the modification of aircraft, the V-22 Protor Blade Erosion Mitigation Program. These are the blades on the V-22 that have a tendency to rapidly erode because of sand and chemicals. And so we would direct the money to that so that that very important airplane can continue to operate. So it's moving money from a unnecessary expenditure, $21 million, and putting it into something that is maintenance and readiness. With that, I yield back and ask for an aye vote.
Gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this amendment. As I've related many times in this committee, DOD's senior-most civilian and uniformed leaders say that the nuclear deterrence is the nation's highest priority. This amendment is an attempt to undercut our nuclear deterrent and plus up other accounts. I urge my colleagues not to take the bait. Two successive Secretaries of Defense have said, as I just described in the previous amendment, that the nuclear deterrence is our most important mission in the department. Fulfilling this deterrence mission is a shared responsibility of both DOD and NNSA. NNSA must deliver the warheads on time to the military. I strongly encourage my colleagues to recognize this for what it is and reject it as an irresponsible amendment. With that, I yield back.
Further discussion on this amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Next, ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. On the way to the desk, I think would be more accurate.
The staff will please distribute the amendment. The ranking member is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has to do with, believe it or not, the Confederate flag and an issue at the Citadel in South Carolina, and it's pretty straightforward. As you are all aware, the governor of South Carolina had the Confederate flag symbol taken down from the state capitol. I forget exactly when, not that long ago. Unfortunately, that flag still flies over the Citadel. And the problem is the South Carolina legislature, after the removal of that flag, passed a law that basically said, you can't, if it's up, you can't take it down unless we pass a law allowing you to take it down. So even though the folks at the Citadel, the commandant there, wants to remove the Confederate flag, they cannot. So what my amendment does is it prohibits the Secretary of a military department from the establishment, maintenance, or support of an educational institution, including a senior military college, that displays in a location other than a museum exhibit the Confederate battle flag. I want to clarify that by display, I don't mean if it's just, you know, in a book somewhere, in a classroom and picture. I mean if the university itself is displaying the flag up a flagpole at its university like they are at the Citadel. This is meant as a forcing mechanism. This would, cut off federal funds and impact the Citadel in a variety of different ways. It does not apply to those who are currently at the Citadel. It would be prospective, not retroactive. But this is meant to remove the Confederate flag. I think the governor of South Carolina made the right decision. It should be a universal decision in this country to not display this, and certainly not at a military institution. When our military is very diversified, persons of color serving us in a variety of ways, what is still a symbol of slavery and the Confederacy. So this amendment is meant to put the Citadel in a position to take down the Confederate flag. I yield back.
I'd recognize myself for the purpose of offering a substitute amendment to Mr. Smith. If the staff would please distribute my substitute. Let me correct myself. This is not a substitute. This is a second-degree amendment to Mr. Smith's amendment, and I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read. Let me just lay this out so everybody knows the full circumstance, and Mr. Smith actually said it exactly right. The underlying amendment is aimed at one institution, and that is the Citadel. My amendment amends Mr. Smith's amendment to exclude educational institutions whose leadership has already voted to take down the Confederate flag. So here's the deal. The Board of Visitors at the Citadel voted on June 24th, 2015, by a vote of 9-3 to remove the Confederate flag from the chapel there. But in South Carolina, there is a state law that requires a 2/3 vote in the state legislature to remove a Confederate flag from any state institution. So there is legislation in the state legislature that is moving to allow this flag to be removed. But in the meantime, what happens if this amendment is agreed to is that every single cadet at the Citadel is punished, because every single cadet at the Citadel is a part of ROTC, and whether it's prospectively or they are punished because all of that ROTC support is removed. Bottom line is, I don't think it's fair to punish those folks that are trying to do the right thing, but it's the folks in the state legislature that is preventing them from doing that now. So my suggestion is to vote yes on my substitute. Let me make one last point. There are an endless number of controversies that we could get into in this bill if we wanted to. But the underlying purpose of this bill is to provide the support for the men and women who are in the military and the missions that they carry out. And I hope we can all keep our focus on that primary mission and not get drawn into a variety of other issues. And I've exceeded my time by 3 seconds.
We forgive you.
That's okay. I appreciate that. Yes. If the gentleman from Washington wishes to be recognized on my amendment.
Yes.
To his amendment.
And the problem with the amendment is it simply says what the Board of Review or the Board of Governors has already done, and it hasn't removed the flag. And what we want to do is we want to force South Carolina to make the decision, make that vote, and actually remove it. Now, we don't punish the ones who are there right now. They've got time, at least until the next class after we pass this bill, which would be at the end of the year, comes in, to look at this and say, look, we shouldn't allow this to fly. If we took it down from the state capitol, we certainly should take it down from the Citadel. And it gives them time to do that. The effect of the substitute amendment is to have no effect. The flag still flies. South Carolina has no pressure whatsoever to change it and probably won't. And that embarrassment still continues to fly over the Citadel, where presumably there are African-American people attending. And I think we need something to force South Carolina to do the right thing, and that is what my amendment would do. The substitute just leaves us right where we're at with the Confederate flag flying over the Citadel. So I would urge opposition to the second-degree amendment and support for the underlying amendment. I yield back.
Other discussion? Gentleman from Utah?
Yes, if the gentleman from Washington would yield to a question.
Absolutely.
And I hope I heard you correctly. Correct me if I did not. On the first page where it says educational institution displays. As a teacher, I have a concern with what that word means because it's undefined. I think you have implied that you did not intend this to mean books, libraries, things that you would do in a classroom, movies, that
Flying
type
a
of
flag,
stuff.
basically, on the campus.
Would, therefore, the gentleman be willing, if this goes forward, to work with us as it goes to the floor, to change, to modify the language so it is very clear what that word displays actually means?
Absolutely. I think that's a fair.
And then I would ask you one other concern I have on the second page, which is it implies that the Secretary of Defense will have the responsibility of searching out whether these things are happening in other schools. Can we work on that one as well to make sure that does not become an onerous task?
Yeah, certainly. It's actually, fortunately, not an onerous task. We've done a fair amount of searching, and as far as we know, this is the only place in which this is the case. But we'll be happy to.
Thank you. And I appreciate your willingness to clarify what the word displays mean. I want that language to be clear on exactly what its intent is. I appreciate that. Thank
Happy
you.
to do
Yield
it.
back.
Thank you.
Mr. Castro?
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question perhaps for one of Mr. Jones or one of the South Carolinians. Is the legislature in session right now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because it's very strange to think of a military institution in the United States flying a flag that is not the Stars and Stripes. That's a very, very strange thing. And so I'm going to be supporting Congressman Smith's amendment.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for addressing this issue. I have faith in the Citadel. As a native of Charleston with 3 brothers-in-law and 2 nephews as Citadel graduates, I know firsthand of the positive integrity of the Citadel. I'm grateful to present a letter dated today from the Office of the President of the Citadel, and I ask unanimous consent for its distribution.
Without objection.
Quote, the Citadel, and this is the letter, quote, the Citadel has been a proven and proud producer of the United States' outstanding military leaders for almost 175 years. Each spring, approximately 30% of the South Carolina Corps of Cadets commissioned to all branches of the U.S. military service after completing their degrees and their ROTC training on campus. For example, the Citadel provides more officers for the U.S. Army than any other college besides West Point and expects to commission 106 for the Army alone this spring. The Citadel's ROTC detachment also serves students from nearby colleges, including the College of Charleston and Charleston Southern University. Federal funding delivered through the Citadel's ROTC detachment of approximately $8 million annually is essential to the successful training of our nation's future military officers at this institution. The loss of the funding would end the ROTC functions and eliminate the college's ability to serve future leaders in our community. On June 24, 2015, the Citadel Board of Trustees voted 9-3 to remove the Confederate Naval Jack from within the Summerall Chapel to a more appropriate location on campus. At that time, we contacted legislative leadership to formally request an amendment be made to the Heritage Act by the South Carolina legislature to allow the flag to be removed. The flag, part of a collection gifted to the college in the 1930s, is considered to be part of a historical monument and therefore cannot be moved by the college under state law. The Citadel prides itself on the core values of duty, honor, and respect, and moving the Naval Jack to another location is consistent with those values, but those values also require the college to follow the law. Lieutenant General John W. Rosa, President of the Citadel. I yield back my time.
Ms. Davis.
But just following up with the letter then, I mean, does anybody have the authority to take down the flag?
Will the gentlelady yield so I can answer the question? Not without the approval of the South Carolina legislature. And we need to force the South Carolina legislature to give them that approval.
So that the vote by the board of directors is meaningless, correct? I mean, in that.
Yeah. Well, it requires a vote by the, if the gentlelady yield, it requires a vote by the state legislature to allow them to follow through on what they've already voted to do.
Right. But.
Yeah.
But they
Ms.
basically
Spear.
said.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. What's the penalty if they take down the flag?
Yeah, I don't know the penalties
Isn't that
under
the-
South Carolina law as the president. What? I don't. Look. Yeah. I don't know what the penalties are. Obviously, the letter from the president of the Citadel says they've got to follow the law. And so I'm sure they're trying to. And they're, you know, again, they're trying to take it down, and they're caught in between these various forces. I'm sorry, is gentlelady yield back? Okay, Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak against the substitute amendment and for the ranking member's amendment. One of the reasons why is there is some history in terms of us compelling universities and to actually act under our direction. Many years ago, I think many of you will remember where we threatened to cut off funds to universities that were not allowing ROTC ROTC programs on their campuses. So we have a history of doing this, and all those universities ended up complying, both private and public. So I believe that this is not a stretch, and we have a right to enforce, at least under this situation, this regulation, and essentially try to make this come to a head with the South Carolina legislature. You know, and there's just other factors that also are involved in this, but the fact that for many people, including me, what their flag represents, in addition to the fact it's the flag of sedition, it is just odd that we're still having this discussion, and we should retire that flag to an appropriate historical place within the college if they like, but it certainly should not be flown where our future cadets, officers will have to see it every day. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Ms. Duckworth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question of the gentleman. Was ROTC threatened, funding for ROTC threatened to be taken away when the Citadel fought so hard to prevent women from entering the college? Is this because I do recall that they have often fought progress, and I'm just wondering if there's a precedent for this with them fighting so hard and had many lawsuits filed against them in order to allow women to attend the university. Was ROTC threatened then, ROTC funding?
Well, if gentlelady's asking me the answer, I don't know the answer. What I do know is that the Board of Visitors voted 9-3 to remove the flag, and they're trying to do that as soon as the state law will permit. And as I said, my understanding is there is an effort in the state legislature to do that, but obviously it has not passed yet.
Reclaiming my time, do you know if they are actively lobbying the state legislature to change the law? Do they actually have an active effort to ask for the law to be changed in the state legislature right now?
My understanding is they have certainly talked to the state legislature. I don't know about definitions of lobbying under state of South Carolina law. But I do know that they are trying to change it. They have asked for it to be changed, and there's an effort in the state legislature to change it.
Reclaiming my time. I find it difficult to support this if there's no evidence that I can see of them actually trying as hard as they can to change the law. This is a school with vast resources and a very large alumni that could probably afford a little bit of lobbying to change the law. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, if I can further correct my previous answer, the letter from the president of the Citadel says, quote, "At that time, we contacted legislative leadership to formally request that an amendment be made to the Heritage Act by the South Carolina legislature allowing the flag to be moved." So that's a more direct answer to the gentlelady's question than I gave her a while ago in the letter by the president. The question is on my substitute to Mr. Smith's amendment. Those in favor of the amendment to the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Washington asked for a recorded vote. We need to go ahead and take that now. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Forbes. Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Ms. Bordallo. Ms. Bordallo votes no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth votes no. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Dr. Fleming. Dr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Gibson. Mr. Gibson votes aye. Mr. Walls. Mr. Walls votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke votes no. Dr. Heck. Dr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Takai. Mr. Takai votes no. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent votes aye. Ms. Graham. Ms. Graham votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Ashford. Mr. Ashford votes no. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mrs. Walorski. Mrs. Walorski votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. MacArthur.
Clerk prepared to report the tally?
Yes, sir.
Please do.
Mr. Chairman, there were 34 aye votes, 28 no votes.
And the amendment is agreed to. Now the question occurs on the underlying Smith amendment as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 5, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with a minority. Without objection, so ordered. If the staff will please pass out en bloc package number 5. Without objection, the amendments are considered read. En bloc package number 5 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 40, R1 by Mr. Takai, that directs Secretary of Defense to provide a briefing on the PLA's participation in RIMPAC. Amendment number 42, R1 by Ms. Bordallo, that directs the Secretary of the Navy to provide a briefing on the feasibility of allowing U.S. port calls in the Pacific for Taiwanese vessels during a certain exercise. Amendment number 46 by Mr. Jones that redesignates the Department of the Navy as the Department of the Navy and Marine Corps. Amendment number 70 by Mr. Conaway that allows the CPB Commissioner to waive polygraph requirements for retiring veteran UAV RPA pilots being hired at DHS. Amendment number 79R1 by Ms. Sanchez that requires a briefing on security standards related to forward deployed U.S. nuclear weapons. Amendment number 142R1 by Mr. Bridenstine that amends Section 1231 of the Chairman's Mark to add additional limitations to the use of funds to approve Russian requests under the Open Skies Treaty. Amendment 159R1 by Mr. Larson that prohibits FY17 and FY18 funding for retaining the option for or to develop a mobile variant of the ground-based strategic deterrent missile. Amendment number 201R2 by Mr. Kaufman that directs an independent entity to conduct an assessment on combatant command structure. Amendment 210R2 by Mr. Walorski that requires the next administration to submit comprehensive detention strategy to Congress in 180 days of inauguration. Amendment number 286 by Mr. Lamborn that amends Section 901 by adding the sense of Congress on geographic combatant commands. Amendment number 331 by myself that replaces Section 1045 with a requirement that Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs evaluate current spectrum authorities and their sufficiency to protect national security spectrum requirements. Amendment number 332 by Ms. Gabbard that directs the Secretary of Defense to provide a briefing on the cost of implementing and maintaining a no-fly zone in Syria. Is there discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly on my Amendment 332 regarding a no-fly zone. This issue, the so-called no-fly zone in Syria, is a dangerous idea that unfortunately continues to be proposed, not only by some of our colleagues, but even some of our presidential candidates. President Obama, Vice President Biden, military leaders like former Chairman Dempsey, as well as our current Chairman Dunford, all have spoken in opposition to a so-called no-fly zone or safe zone. President Obama spoke recently in Europe again how this so-called safe zone just won't work for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it would cost billions of dollars. We'd need to commit tens of thousands of ground troops to take over vast amounts of Syrian territory, yet no one offers details on whose troops they would be. And even incredibly deeply concerning is that this action would really bring us directly into conflict with Russia in two ways. In order to set up a no-fly zone, the first thing you've got to do is go in and bomb Syrian and Russian anti-aircraft defense systems. And secondly, there's no reason to believe that Russian or Syrian aircraft would abide by the no-fly zone. So then we're faced with a position where you either ruin American credibility by not enforcing it, or you shoot down a Russian plane, bringing the world's two nuclear powers into direct conflict. So it's important for the Congress and the American people to get some answers on this. This amendment simply requires the Secretary of Defense to come and provide a briefing on exactly what the cost and consequences of this no-fly zone in Syria would be. I yield back.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, I'm sorry, Mr. Lamborn.
I want to thank the chairman for including my amendment in the en bloc package. Real briefly, as was found in the last independent assessment and every other time it has been studied, COCOM consolidation would degrade mission effectiveness and increase risk. In addition, multiple Combatant commanders have shared concerns with this committee about decreasing global influence and furthering the perception of U.S. disengagement and unreliability. The fact is, each geographic command is utterly unique in terms of mission, emphasis, expertise, requirements, and responsibilities, and each geographic command has a vital role both in peace as well as war. NORTHCOM's mission exemplifies this uniqueness as it protects the homeland from the full spectrum of threats from terrorism to nuclear. Specifically, both Northern and Southern commanders have said that their missions are totally different from each other and cannot be merged without risk and expense. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the amendments in the en bloc package, and I yield back.
This late at night punishes me, Sally.
Committee will come to order. We're trying to wind this baby down. Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I just want to thank Mr. Conaway for his amendment working with us in Homeland Security about fast-tracking our veterans for these CBP jobs. I just want to say I'd like to work with him. I thank him for the work on the issue. I'd like to continue to refine this provision before the bill reaches the floor so we can maximize the number of veterans who will be eligible for a waiver of this polygraph, and I yield back.
Further discussion on the en bloc package? If not, the question is on en bloc package number 5. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. If everybody could just hold tight for a second, we have one additional issue that we have to deal with, and there's discussions and copying going on, and let me see where we are, and we can proceed. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, is recognized for the purpose of offering amendment number 308, if he chooses to. Gentlemen wish to offer that amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
If the staff would please distribute Frank's number 308. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, before the ink was dry on the Iran deal, the Saudis began making a deal with Russia and China to develop 16 nuclear reactors. And Russia is now brokering a deal with Egypt to build 4 more nuclear reactors. Thanks to the Obama administration, nuclear proliferation in the Middle East has begun. And now we've just been told that President Obama and his crack team of expert negotiators plan to prop up and further exacerbate this preposterous farce they call the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action by paying Iran millions of dollars to purchase heavy water and thereby incentivizing Tehran to produce more heavy water, which is a key component in their quest to develop nuclear weapons. We have all just recently watched in real time as Iran has blatantly violated UN Security Council resolutions with their ballistic missile tests. The President's own State Department admits their missile launches put them at odds with international law. And yet on April Fool's Day this year, President Obama criticized the Iranian leaders for undermining the, quote, spirit of the nuclear deal, even as they stick to the, quote, letter of the pact. Mr. Chairman, if Iran can conduct ballistic missile tests and produce heavy water under the President's deal without violating the, quote, letter of the law, then what can't they do? And what further betrayal of America and human freedom is the Obama administration willing to embrace to capitulate to Iran and their inexorable march to nuclear weapons? Now, unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I'm told that Mr. Obama intends to finalize this heavy water purchase before this amendment can take effect, and that Democrats have promised to kill the entire defense bill if a vote is taken. So to protect what's left of our national security from the Obama administration, I will withdraw this amendment.
Gentleman withdraws the amendment. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, have an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not be offering my amendment because it's very similar to Representative Frank's amendment. I will speak in favor of his and finish up.
Okay. Without objection, the gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not offer my similar amendment. I back up Representative Frank's, and I'm just disappointed that the administration is so hell-bent on mollifying Iran that it will buy heavy water that they're overproducing. This is in violation of the JCPOA. And to reward them for violating the agreement doesn't make any sense. And also to give them hard dollars, 8 or 9 million American dollars, when they're in violation of UN protocols, so that they should be under sanctions and not receiving hard currency like that from the West. So in so many ways, it is wrong what the administration is doing. I back up Representative Franks. We should do everything we can to stop this purchase of heavy water, but apparently the administration is going to find the money and do it before this becomes law. So I'm deeply disappointed in that. I agree with Representative Franks, but at this point, the administration has won round one on this one, but there will be a new administration come January, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has now expired. The next amendment shown is gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
If the staff would please distribute Kaufman number 197.
He's a Russian.
You're unabashed, my friend.
All right. Hey, Mike. Sell out to the Soviets.
What is this? I can't.
Did we ever have the new ballot?
Yeah.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
The current number in law is 4. That's the only chance I have for you. It's not 9, it's 4.
Okay.
And the gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would further amend Section 1608 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2015 to increase the authorized number of Russian-supplied rocket engines for the evolved expendable launch vehicle program from 9 to 18 engines. As everyone on this committee is aware, assured access to space is indispensable to our national security. As a result, current law requires the availability of at least 2 space launch vehicles or 2 families of vehicles capable of placing into orbit any national security payload. The Atlas V launch vehicle is absolutely essential to maintaining our nation's assured access to space and delivering these crucial national security payloads. However, the members of this committee are also aware of the need to divest the United States of any reliance on Russian rocket engines. Ending our reliance on Russian engines is clearly in the national security interest of the United States, but not at the expense of the paramount requirement of assured access for national security missions. Over the last 15 months, various congressional committees have received constant and repeated testimony from senior defense officials on the vital defense need to continue the use of Russian engines until a new domestic engine is certified for national security space missions. This includes testimony from the Secretary of the Air Force, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisitions, the Commander of the Air Force Space Command, the Director of National Intelligence, as well as the Secretary of Defense. Not only would a hasty prohibition on Russian engines harm our national security, it would also harm launch competition and raise serious concerns over fiscal responsibility. The Air Force has asked for 18 Russian-made engines to ensure a safe, practical, and responsible transition away from the RD-180 powered Atlas V rocket, and that is exactly what my amendment does. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Further discussion on the amendment offered by Mr. Kaufman, Mr. Brooks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, before the Senate Appropriations Committee Defense Subcommittee, President Obama, Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter spoke, and I'm going to read from a part of the transcript. This is a senator's question. Quote, "The RD-180 engines, we've talked about this. We've worked with you before on that. Some of us have here. And how important is it, for us to build the American engine, which we all want to do, you know, down the road, not to rely on anybody except ourselves. And how important is it that we have those engines, a number of them for a few years, that we do this for our national security," end quote. To which Secretary of Defense Ash Carter replied, quote, "Well, our budget does propose that we continue to buy RD-180s for a time, and I'll explain why. Down the road, we want to have 2 or more competitive launch service providers that are purely American. That's where we'd like to get to. In the meantime, we have to launch our national security payloads, and where there's 2 ways we can do that. We can hold our noses, buy RD-180s until that situation is created, and fly Atlases with RD-180s. The alternative is to fly our payloads on Delta, which is technically feasible but much more expensive. And so that's the choice. And we have chosen the choice of going Atlas, recognizing the distasteful fact that that necessitates purchases of up to 18 more RD-180 engines," end quote. Bottom line, if we don't go with this amendment, it's going to cost American taxpayers more. That's going to increase our already high borrowing costs, worsen our deficits, and I would ask that this committee support Representative Kaufman's amendment.
Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's one mild correction to Mr. Brooks' comments. We would not be without an option. In fact, what we're trying to ensure with the purchase of these engines is competition. SpaceX has built a launch vehicle and an engine that will fill this space. The purpose of buying these engines is not to make sure that we have something to launch. The purpose of buying these engines is to make sure that, ironically, SpaceX doesn't wind up without competition for a certain number of launches. It's estimated at, I think, 36 launches between now and 2022, which are competitive. There is a certain number of launches that have already been granted to ULA on a non-competitive basis because SpaceX just recently got into the game. But the purpose of buying these engines is to make sure that there is an alternative to SpaceX so that we don't just have one bidder. The number 18 is pulled pretty much out of thin air. What we need, and what I talked about proposing, but we did not get consensus on it, was to say, look, as long as it's necessary to buy a Russian engine to have competition, then you can buy it. When it's not necessary, you can't. Because there's a lot of great things going on out there. We've got a lot of companies, SpaceX itself, Blue Origin, Aerojet, that are developing new engines. Now, the estimates are 2020, 2021, if we're lucky, maybe 2019. So we are not that far away from having engines that will totally free us from any dependency on the Russian engine. And my concern is, if we get the number too big, is that a disincentive to get that new engine, to get us where we need to be? So I'm not thrilled about the 18 number, but I do agree that we need to have competition. I say ironically because when this whole thing started, ULA had a monopoly. And they said, look, we have to have a monopoly because competition isn't possible, it's too expensive, it can't be done. And actually, in what is a great American innovation story, they were proven wrong. SpaceX went out and with their own money, imagine that, built a competitive rocket. And now you've got Blue Origin and other companies out there that are doing that as well. So I think the competition is coming, but in the meantime, we do need a bridge. This is something we're going to continue to work on. Though the 18 is imperfect, I will support that bridge. of 18, but it is something that's going to be worked on in conference because the Senate has a different view of this issue. I yield back and apologize for going over.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is no issue I've spent more time on in my 14 years in Congress than this one over the last 3.5 years as chairman of Strat Forces. I fully support the gentleman's amendment for this reason. I want people to understand we are in the process now of competing with multiple companies for an American-made engine. We fully expect to have an American-made engine to replace the RD-180, the Russian-made RD-180, by 2019. Frankly, it should have been done 30 years ago, but it's our fault. We've got ourselves in this situation by kicking the can down the road. But we are where we are. But by 2019, all agree that we believe we will have an American-made engine that's proven. Unfortunately, it will take another 3 years for that engine to be certified. We just have to accept that fact. We have now 4 engines that we can use, RD-180s engines, that will get us through next year's national security launches. Between next year and 2022, we need 12 to 14 more engines. 14 is the comfortable number. That's what this is all about, making sure that we're going to be able to get our national security payloads into space between now and 2022 when a new American-made engine will be proven and certified. That's all this is about, period. I hope the members will recognize that and support this gentleman's responsible amendment.
Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just heard a few moments ago about how America is going to be purchasing heavy water from a country that has potentially trying to get nuclear weapons and do harm to our great country. Isn't it ironic that we're now going to give hundreds of millions of dollars for an engine to a country who has nuclear weapons and want to do us harm, versus an American company with an American engine? I yield back.
Let me do Mr. Fleming and then others.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of the Kaufman Amendment, and I offer the rest of my time to Mr. Kaufman.
I think the gentleman from Louisiana, just one point, the SpaceX, and I think it's, competition is wonderful, and I think it's already, I think, impacted ULA, made them better in terms of bringing down costs. But the Falcon 9 is not certified yet to be able to launch the heavier kind of satellites that DoD needs in terms of access to space. And so that will certainly happen. And so what we're relegated with, if we don't get the RD-180 anymore, is to, again, I think it was said, to use the much more expensive Delta rocket to do those launches. And it's estimated that the cost over a 5-year period in terms of testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee by the Secretary of the Air Force would be about $1.5 billion. And so I just think that we want to get off the RD-80. We want to do it as soon as we can, but we want to do it in a reasonable and responsible way. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You can see on the board there that I have an amendment coming up that was ruled out of order because HPSC would not give a waiver to it. All it did was change the number from 18 to 9. We're going to be here next year. We're going to be here the year after that. Congress isn't going away, and we can look at this again, and they can come back and say, we need this many over the next couple of years. There's no reason for us to line Putin's pockets right now and allow us to stockpile these when we don't need 18 right now. We can get away right now with 9 probably, 9 or 10. So I would ask the gentleman if he would bring that number down to something that's more realistic to what we actually need right now. What we don't want to do is jump ahead at $540 million in direct payments to the Russian military modernization, which is what we're contributing to. Just realize that when we vote yes or no on this, if you vote yes, you are literally contributing directly to Russian military modernization. SpaceX today got an award to shoot the GPS-3 satellite into space. Guess what it cost them? $82 million. The the same launch from ULA costs $200 million. That's a $120 million difference. So not only would you save money with the $82 million, you're not going to be modernizing the Russian military, where we're going to vote to arm or to outfit our military to
Would
go
the
up
gentleman
against
yield?
them. Absolutely. Happy to yield.
Again, SpaceX does not have the heavy launch capability right now. We want to get off this situation as soon as we can. This is about U.S. national security and our access to space.
Reclaiming my time, would the gentleman go down from 18 to 9 or 10?
This number comes from the Department of Defense.
No, the Secretary,
that
reclaiming my time, I got 5 seconds. The Secretary of Defense says that they need up to 18. They didn't say 18. I yield back.
cut me off.
Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Chairman, I realize that because Mr. Hunter didn't get a waiver because it's HPC and we're not getting that waiver tonight, and I'm told that Mr. Kaufman's amendment, even if we change one little comma or something, requires us to go back and get another waiver. Now, I have a lot of respect for the chairman, Mr. Rogers, and he mentioned that he thought that the amount would be a dozen of these engines. So here's the thing, if we can't get a waiver tonight, and a lot of us don't believe that we need to purchase 18, Mr. Hunter's saying that 9, that we're going to be, well, I'm not going to be back next year here, but that you all will be back, that Congress will be back and can continue this. Why do we need to vote this amendment tonight? I mean, why don't you work on this? Why don't we work on this to get it to the floor and to get an amount that would be more in line with the dozen that you spoke of or with the 9 that Mr. Hunter said? I mean, there's no reason to rush into spending this money just because that's the only waiver we have at this point. That would just be
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Did Mr. Chairman say?
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Well, it's a gentle lady, but yes.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady. It is. What time is it? It is. I think the issue is up to 18. Hopefully, it will certainly be less. But for planning purposes, to have
Well,
certainty of that number.
Reclaiming my
maintain
time.
access.
Who's got an answer? Who's got an answer? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm listening to several conversations going on here, Mr. Kaufman, and I've got no time left. And I yield back.
Let me yield to Mr. Bishop.
Can I urge adoption of this particular amendment? Look, we made several mistakes years ago to bring us to this particular situation. Would that we could go back and change the process again. But I've heard a lot of comparisons out here that are not apples to apples. We have 4, we need 14, the number that the chairman said, to get us to 18, which is what we need to do that bridge. That's why that number is actually there. It's not out of thin air, it's not best guess. It is best guess, but it's not out of thin air. There's a reason for that. And to have this gives us a chance to bridge the gap. Had we made decisions differently earlier, we would not be in this situation, but we did not. And that's why we need to have this guarantee. That's significantly important for the way we go in the future. That's why the number is there. We need to move forward. I urge adoption of this amendment. I support Mr. Kaufman and his efforts.
Mr. Conaway.
Yeah, just real quickly, just to make sure we understand, it says use of a total of 18. Does this amendment require purchase of 14, 18, or does it allow the Department of Defense the discretion to manage the purchase contract in the best interest of the taxpayer and national defense?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
My understanding it is up to 18, but doesn't have to be 18.
So,
but it is established as a cap of 18.
All right. So the Department of Defense could use its discretion to get the best deal. Okay.
Gentleman yield. That's correct. Yield back.
Mr. Chair, could I ask you to yield for a question on that? I don't believe it's the Department of Defense's choice under this amendment. It's actually ULA's choice This authorizes ULA to buy up to 18, and they would have the option, not the Department of Defense. Am I incorrect about that?
Jim Yield?
Yeah.
Well, it's obviously ULA is the one that has to get over, working with some of their partner entities to develop a new engine along with a new launch system. They're given a window to be able to do that through the number of RD 180 engines that are specified in the amendment.
If the gentleman will yield, my understanding is this authorizes up to 18 to be purchased, but they would be government funds that do the purchasing, so that depends on the appropriations, of course, on how much money there is to buy them, because this is not private funds, these are government funds that are buying these engines. Why furrowed brow?
Well, because I know that ULA has bought a number of Russian engines which they use for commercial launches, and there's been some debate about whether or not they use them for commercial or for whatever, and that they need to be specifically authorized to use them for a government launch. But I thought it was ULA that was purchasing them. Can staff help me out here? Am I?
Is there a factual answer here that y'all can provide?
The original language from the FY15 NDAA, Section 1608, is it states that the Secretary of Defense may not award or renew a contract for the procurement of property or services for space launch activities under the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle Program if such contract carries out such space launch activities using rocket engines designed or manufactured in the Russian Federation. And then this is an exception to that prohibition.
Right. So Secretary of Defense has to contract for, I guess, a certain amount. So, okay, Mr. Lobiondo.
Question: if the Kaufman amendment does not pass tonight, is it safe to assume we're going to see this on the floor? We're going to see this issue again.
Well, obviously,
we're going to see it one way or
that
another.
will depend on the Rules Committee on what is considered on the floor. So I can't give anybody a definitive answer on that.
Seems to me 2 o'clock in the morning, pretty big issue, dealing with the Russians, and we're likely to see it again. That's all.
Yeah, I think, sorry, if the gentleman yield, I think we will continue to work on this issue. I might just explain the reason we're doing it at the last minute is because there have been negotiations all day long to try to resolve this. That's the reason it kept being pushed back to the end. So it has been worked on all day. It was not intentionally.
I'm not faulting you, Mr.
No, I just want everybody to explain, to understand what's been happening all day. There have been negotiations. Ultimately, there was not an agreement, and so this is the amendment that has received the waiver, and so this is what we can bring to the committee.
I understand the national security implications, but for some of us, the lump in our throat to give this money to Putin is a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, I understand. Mr. Garamendi.
May as well jump into this one. Let me see if I recall history correctly. Putin invades little green men into Ukraine, right? He sends his jets to buzz our fleet in the Baltic. He does all of these things, and then we're going to go turn around and buy 18 of his rocket engines. When we really don't need to do it right now, I don't quite get it. I don't know why we are giving all of this to Mr. Putin so that he can say, see?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah,
you're correct in the sense when Russia did the incursion into the Ukraine, that's when the RDA 180 issue rose up, and that's when the necessity to transition away from it was established, and we are on that process right now. Yield back.
Wait a minute. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, sir. Are we not buying an additional 18 rockets from him? Is that not what this is all
Will the gentleman yield, please? Gentleman from California, yield.
Of course.
Mr. Garamendi, we are not doing this to help Putin. We're doing this to help ourselves. This is about our national security access to space. Our
Really?
defense manifest only. We're not talking about commercial launches. We're talking about, you know, if Putin wanted to hurt us, he could just cut these engines off. I don't know why he hadn't, but he hadn't. Let's buy the engine so we can guarantee our access for our defense satellites into space.
So Russia doesn't get anything out of this, right?
One of their
Are
companies
you kidding me?
One of their companies gets employment. Whatever. If we had been doing our job over the last 30 years, we wouldn't be in this situation.
Well,
But we
isn't
haven't
Mr.
done our
Putin going
job.
to have fun
We need to do
just
it now.
saying America can't
we need
get
to
its
support
job
the
done, so
Kaufman
he has to
Amendment.
go to Russia.
Committee will be in order. Unless there's somebody else that really wants to talk on this. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Kaufman, number 197. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I believe the ranking member's up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
If the staff would please pass out 196R2.
Where's Paul?
We're not okay with the language. We're working on it. We're not okay with the language. This was a surprise.
If you, would y'all suspend in distributing just for a second? Hold your place for just a second. I think there's a question about the language and what's being passed out, so just hold for a second. Okay, committee will be in order. If y'all would suspend the passing out of this amendment while this is sorted out, here's what I propose. We've got 5 roll call votes we need to take. How about going ahead and getting those done? And meanwhile, they'll be working on this language, and we'll come back and do that. So, or never mind. Okay, I'm sorry. I am sending y'all back and forth. Let's go ahead and finish that. Let's pass that out. I apologize for the confusion. Thank you, ma'am. Without objection, Smith, number 196R2 is considered as read, and the distinguished ranking member is recognized.
This is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to keep it short because it's late. I want to thank Mr. Rogers for working with us on this. You know, part of the funding for this new engine is coming from the government. The overwhelming majority of it is coming from the private sector, from a variety of different companies actually that are working on it. Blue Origin, Aerojet, ULA, and there's partnerships and all kinds of confusing stuff going on. But the purpose of this amendment is to allow some of that money that's developing a new engine to also be used to develop a new launch vehicle to go with that engine. Because an engine is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't help if it doesn't have a launch vehicle that it can go into. And this allows for some portion of that money that we've set aside to go there. I could say more, but I won't. Again, I just want to thank Chairman Rogers for his work on this issue and for agreeing to include this language, and I urge adoption.
Other discussion on this amendment, Mr. Conaway?
Just curious, on one of the pay-fors is $23,428,000 coming out of administrative and service-wide activities. Does this lead us to believe that that account was already inflated by that amount, and that amount could have been cut earlier for some other reason? I mean, why would they have excess $23 million that you could just simply swing at? We've been doing this all night, by the way, just curious.
Yeah, the answer to that question is because when you're developing something, you can sometimes get ahead of yourself.
Okay, so you'd already inflated what other places have we inflated the budget like this or the authorization like this to pending future stuff? No,
you don't have anything to do this morning? This happens, okay? It's not great that it happens, but every once in a while, in fact, frequently, we appropriate more money for a given program than the Department of Defense can spend in that fiscal year. And what happens is,
yeah, but reclaiming my time, this is administrative and service-wide activities. Isn't that just catch-all? It's coming out of administrative and service-wide activities. There's nothing specific about that other than just...
But there's slush funds and everything.
It's a slush fund. Well, that makes me feel even better.
Thanks, Loretta. That helped enormously.
I'm saying, he asked me what other places.
If I could just finish, it'll take me 30 seconds. All I'm saying is that we appropriate money frequently for a given fiscal year, and then they can't spend as much because the testing doesn't go as well as they expected. A lot of times, they spend it in the next fiscal year or the next fiscal year. That's sometimes they determine they can't spend it all and they come back and reprogram. In the grand scheme of all of that, Mike, this is minuscule compared to what has happened on a lot of other programs.
Well, we've got an awful lot of unmet operational needs that $24 million could have bought.
In this case, they are going to spend the money, and this is not a lot of money. They're going to spend the money on an engine and a launch vehicle to help get us to stop having to buy Russian engines. This is the bottom line. That's where they're going to spend the money. So, urge adoption.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief about it, but the numbers I see in this are $100 million. I mean, we've just had this on our desk for about 5 minutes. That's a lot of money.
Okay.
By anybody's definition that I know of, and a lot of different code sections. I don't know how anybody could reference where it is and where it goes.
Will the gentleman yield? I can answer that.
A lot of money.
Will the gentleman yield? I can answer that question. There is already in our bill, and Mr. Rogers can correct me if I'm wrong, $294 million to go towards the development of a new engine to give us an alternative to the Russian engine. That money has been in the bill for a long time. We had money in, I believe, FY15 and 16 as well to do the same thing. Just, I'll finish it. It's very, very straightforward. That money was already in the bill. And in the bill, as it was written, it was only allowed to go towards the development of the engine. This amendment does not add any money to anything. It takes out of that $294 million some money to also help those same companies that are developing the engine develop a launch vehicle to go with it. It doesn't add any money. It's the money that was already in the bill. It simply says you can use it for this other purpose, which is directly connected to the engine.
Well, with due respect, it's still a $100 million change that just hit our desk. I'll yield the remainder of my time.
No, I think it's appropriate to ask questions like that.
That's
so,
fine.
yeah, don't worry about that. Somebody, oh, yeah, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I think nearly all of us agree that we need the engine development, that these dollars and set-asides are for the engine development, I take exception to the need that we need a new launch vehicle and that these expenditures would somehow be small. You're not taking into account that you would have to change billions of dollars of infrastructure, new launch pads, new equipment for the launching of these rockets, new communication facilities to communicate with all of the things that we currently have with our Delta and Atlas systems. Further, a Falcon 9 system is very immature. It's not versatile. It can't deliver the upper payloads that we need. I take great exception to what will ultimately billions of dollars of expenditure if we go down the new launch vehicle path. If the basics of flight and the basics of rocketry and aerodynamics have not changed in 100 years.
If the gentleman will yield.
I will not just yet, if the ranking member will allow. I've had the privilege from our home state to have lengthy conversations with General Thomas Stafford, who is a national hero, a Gemini two-time, also Apollo two-time, and a commander of the Apollo Soyuz. And we have had lengthy discussions on this issue. I trust his judgment. We do not need a new launch vehicle. It will result in billions of dollars of expenditure, and it will not deliver the best bang for the buck at a time when we need to keep Marines and Army soldiers in uniform and flags in the field. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Ranking member.
As a matter of fact, we do desperately need a new launch vehicle. And if the subcommittee chairman could help me out here at some point, that would be wonderful. The Delta and who knows more about this than I do, the Delta and the Atlas are unbelievably expensive. In fact, ULA will tell you, they can't in this hearing, they will tell you they are building a new launch vehicle precisely because they're not going to be able to compete with SpaceX's new launch vehicle if they're still using the Delta and the Atlas come 22 and 2023, because these are unbelievably expensive launch vehicles. They're building something, I forget the name of it, the Vulcan, I believe. Nods from the back of the room. They're building the Vulcan. So we're getting a new launch vehicle because the existing launch vehicles are really expensive.
Yeah.
Yield to Mr. Wright. Well, not my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do want to concur with the ranking member. The fact is, while my focus has been on building a new engine, and that's my primary focus, I do acknowledge that even no matter which engine is successful in the competition, there are going to have to be some modifications made to the Atlas system. There may have to be dramatic modifications made based on who wins. There's one engine in particular in the competition. If it wins, there will be dramatic modifications. So it's inevitable that we're going to spend some money on these upper stages. So I think that what we're doing with this modification for the ranking member is a responsible one, and I urge the members to vote yes for it.
Okay. Question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Smith. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Okay. Yeah. Let me ask unanimous consent that Gallego Amendment Number 211, as amended by my substitute, be adopted. Without objection, is so ordered. Y'all misled me on that, and I needed to clean that up. Now we are going to proceed to vote on those amendments where a roll call was ordered. It's 5 votes: Russell 232, Klein 17, Gabbard 282, Tsongas 69, and Waltz 262. So the question before us is the amendment offered by Mr. Russell of Oklahoma, number 232R2, clarification of protections for religious organizations. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith. No. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Forbes. Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Ms. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Garimondi? Mr. Garimondi votes no. Mr. Schuster? Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Conaway? Mr. Conaway votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peter votes no. Dr. Fleming? Dr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson votes aye. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls votes no. Ms. Hartzler? Ms. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke? Mr. O'Rourke votes no. Dr. Heck? Dr. Heck votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Takai? Mr. Takai votes no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent votes aye. Ms. Graham? Ms. Graham votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Ashford? Mr. Ashford votes no. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mrs. Walorski? Mrs. Walorski votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. MacArthur?
Yeah. Clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, there are 33 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is adopted. The question now comes on amendment number 13 by Mr. Klein of Minnesota related to the exemption of DOD from the enforcement of the executive order related to labor laws. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry?
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith? No. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Jones? No. Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez? Yes. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. Brady? No. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Miller? Aye. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Ms. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Schuster? Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Conway? Mr. Conway votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Dr. Fleming? Dr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson votes aye. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls votes no. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke? Mr. O'Rourke votes no. Dr. Heck? Dr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Takai? Mr. Takai votes no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent votes aye. Ms. Graham? Ms. Graham votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Ashford? Mr. Ashford votes no. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mrs. Walorski? Mrs. Walorski votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Ms. Sanchez?
Is this the Russell?
Klein?
I'm sorry, did I, okay, oh, the Klein. See, I thought it was, okay, no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. MacArthur?
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 34 ayes and 28 noes.
The amendment is adopted. Now the question arises on Amendment 282R2 by Ms. Gabbard of Hawaii related to striking the authorization for the Syria Train and Equip program. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry?
No.
Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mr. Smith? No. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Jones? Yes. Mr. Jones votes yes. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes no. Mr. Brady? No. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Miller? Yes. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Ms. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes yes. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Schuster? Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Conway? Mr. Conway votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Dr. Fleming? Dr. Fleming votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman votes no. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes yes. Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson votes yes. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls votes no. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. O'Rourke? Mr. O'Rourke votes yes. Dr. Heck? Dr. Heck votes yes. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Takai? Mr. Takai votes yes. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent votes no. Ms. Graham? Ms. Graham votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Ashford? Mr. Ashford votes no. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mrs. Walorski? Mrs. Walorski votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes yes. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez and McCarthy didn't vote.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 9 ayes and 52 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on amendment number 69 by the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Songus, related to striking the section regarding the sage grouse. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry?
No.
Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes yes. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Ms. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Schuster? Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Conway? Mr. Conway votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes aye. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Dr. Fleming? Dr. Fleming votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Kaufman votes no. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson votes no. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. O'Rourke? Mr. O'Rourke votes aye. Dr. Heck? Dr. Heck votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Takai? Mr. Takai votes yes. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent votes no. Ms. Graham? Ms. Graham votes aye. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Ashford? Mr. Ashford votes yes. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes aye. Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes aye. Mrs. Walorski? Mrs. Walorski votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 27 ayes and 35 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Question now occurs on amendment number 262 by Mr. Waltz to strike section 311 relating to prohibition on funding for alternative fuels. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry?
No.
Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Jones? No. Mr. Jones votes no. Mrs. Sanchez? Aye. Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Forbes? No. Mr. Forbes votes no. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller? No. Mr. Miller votes no. Mrs. Davis? Aye. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Mrs. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo? Ms. Bordillo votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Ms. Songus? Ms. Songus votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Schuster? Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Conway? Mr. Conway votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes aye. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Dr. Fleming? Dr. Fleming votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey? Mr. Kaufman? Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson votes aye. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. O'Rourke? Mr. O'Rourke votes aye. Dr. Heck? Dr. Heck votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Takai? Mr. Takai votes aye. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent votes no. Ms. Graham? Ms. Graham votes aye. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Ashford? Mr. Ashford votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes aye. Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes aye. Mrs. Walorski? Mrs. Walorski votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 33 ayes and 29 noes.
The amendment is adopted. If there are no further amendments to this portion of the mark, Chair recognizes the gentleman for Virginia, Mr. Forbes, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the chairman's mark as amended.
Questions on the motion of the gentleman for Virginia? So many as in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A quorum being present, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. As we move towards final passage, let me just take a moment to thank members for your patience and for all of your work that has gone into this mark. And I also want to thank the staff. However tired y'all think, you members think you are, I was getting emails at 1 o'clock last night from the staff, so this is their second straight night at least of doing this. So I really want to thank the committee staff, the personal staff. I also want to thank Legislative Council that has been really terrific in allowing us to get through all of this. And I also want to thank our friends in the press who have stayed with us, including our C-SPAN cameramen. And I think it's important that in the House we do this where everybody can see. And I think that's important. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first of all concur in those remarks. The staff has done a fabulous job, for weeks in the build up to this and during the course of today. If it wasn't for the great work of the staff, we would be here for another 4 or 5 hours. They negotiate and work out language and get it fixed and do just an amazing job all day long that is largely unseen by most of us, but miraculously things get fixed and get done very well. I want to thank the chairman in particular, a great partner to work with, and this committee is maintaining its bipartisan tradition. We worked through a lot of issues today, a lot of controversial issues, and I think we did it well, and we did it the way legislation is supposed to be done. We had good debates, disagreed, and we voted, and we passed, or are about to pass, a very significant piece of legislation. I will just say, and I am going to vote for this piece of legislation, but the fiscal cliff issue is no small matter, and I take the comparisons to 2008, and I say this not as a criticism, just as a reality. This is different. We have the Budget Control Act from 2011. We have the budget caps coming. If we continue down the route that this bill goes down, which has the OCO running out somewhere about halfway through the year, counting on a supplemental in this environment versus the environment we had before, a much, much, much more risky proposition. Now, I'm not leaping up to want to say where we cut $18 billion out of the base either. I have a few ideas. I don't know that I got $18 billion worth of ideas. But at some point, we are going to have to live within our means, the means that we've decided to provide. I would love to see the Budget Control Act go away tomorrow, but if it doesn't, we are going to have some very, very difficult decisions, and we have artfully put those off. But I think every member needs to prepare for how exactly to approach that reckoning when it comes, and that continues to be my concern about the underlying bill. But there's a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of good work was done, and I plan to support the bill. And again, I thank the chairman, every single member of this committee, and the staff for their outstanding work.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report the bill H.R. 4909 as amended favorably to the House with a recommendation that it do pass.
Questions on the motion of the gentleman from Virginia? Submitters in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The chair calls for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Thornberry. Aye. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Jones. Aye. Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Sanchez. Aye. Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Forbes. Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Ms. Bordillo. Ms. Bordillo votes aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Songus. Ms. Songus votes aye. Mr. Franks. Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Conway. Mr. Conway votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth votes aye. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Dr. Fleming. Dr. Fleming votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mr. Gibson. Mr. Gibson votes aye. Mr. Walls. Mr. Walls votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. O'Rourke votes aye. Dr. Heck. Dr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Takai. Mr. Takai votes aye. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent votes aye. Ms. Graham. Ms. Graham votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Ashford. Mr. Ashford votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar votes aye. Mrs. Walorski. Mrs. Walorski votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes aye. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes aye.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, there are 60 ayes and 2 noes.
A quorum being present, the motion is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Chair recognizes the ranking member from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, consistent with House rules, I would like to assert the right of any member to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views for inclusion in the committee's report to the House on the bill just ordered reported.
Pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, all members are entitled to not less than 2 calendar days to file such views in writing. I ask unanimous consent staff be authorized to make necessary conforming technical and clerical changes and to remove from the bill as amended provisions that would cause the bill to be referred to other committees or would result in additional direct spending or that would result in an earmark. Without objection, so ordered. Finally, I ask unanimous consent the chairman be authorized to make such motions on the floor as necessary to go to conference with the Senate on the bill H.R. 4909 or similar Senate measure. Without objection, so ordered. There's no further business. Committee stands adjourned.